I will begin slowly, as befits a man, who has lived most of his life at the pace of village bells and changing seasons. If you will take my hand for a moment, I will guide you along the hedgerows where the nettles sting and the finches skitter, down the lane that leads to our little settlement called Wall. There, as the name promises, stands a wall of grey stone, old as the wind's memory, straight as a vow, with one narrow gap watched day and night by two sober souls. On one side of the wall, cabbages, cows, and the comfort of Sunday dinners. On the other, a meadow that is not a meadow, a field that is not a field, and at the 9th year's turn, a market that is not merely a market. I am Dunstan Thorn, a husband, a shopkeeper, a man with decent boots and an inconvenient heart. This is the beginning of my account, told in the first person when I must confess, and in the third when my gaze must widen beyond the length of my arm, for there are scenes no single man can hold by himself. Come with me. The lantern is lit, the kettle hums, the night is patient. It was in the 9th year when Wall drowsed, and then woke to the rumour of marvels. People in plain coats climbed stiles and peered from the hedges, whispering about fox-faced traders and bottles that sang and knives that cut shadows. For days beforehand the gap in the wall was closed and watched, because folk beyond the village wished to come through, and folk within wished even more fiercely to go out. The old men at the gap carried staves and the authority of long custom. Wall minds conventions like a miser counts coins. Yet customs bend in the wind of the 9th year, and on the appointed day the watchers of the gap stand aside, and the people spill into the meadow at dusk, and the meadow changes into a fair unlike any fair that ever trod the mortal green. The lamps in that meadow burned blue and green, and a colour I could not name. Music moved through the air like ribboned smoke. I saw a man in a coat of bird's feathers selling storm-filled eggs that shook with distant thunder. I saw a woman polish a mirror until it showed what you had not yet lost. A fox, tall as a boy, argued with a rabbit about the price of a map, and at the edge of it all a trader with cloudy eyes laid out snowdrops wrought from glass, each petal veined with frost, each flower cold as winter's wrist. I was not yet a husband then, and the world was more an ache than a fact. The reality of Wall felt steady, the fair made it tremble. Among the tents, hung with woven night and bottled moonlight, there was a wagon draped in scarlet, and beside it sat a young woman with a silver chain around her ankle. She was fair in the old sense of the word, which is to say that the sight of her was a matter of justice as much as beauty. The chain ran to the wrist of another woman, older, watchful, with eyes that weighed. Later I learned people called her a witch. Names hardly matter when you are 20, and the air tastes like unkept promises. I stood there too long, a rustic in a Sunday coat, until the older woman laughed and struck a bargain with me for a glass snowdrop. A kiss, she said, for the flower, and more if the knight agreed. That is how the old tales put it, as if bargains are struck in sentences instead of slow glances. You already know, perhaps, that the snowdrop mattered less than the door it opened, and that the door opened less than what waited in the dark beyond it. I will not embroider those hours. It is enough to say that a captive girl and a foolish boy became a memory that would not stay put. Years pass quickly when you live by shop ledgers and seasons. I wed a good woman, and we kept a small, tidy house on the village street. We sold nails and oil, twine and tin, and when the days shortened, we put the kettle forward and counted the pennies. A village man is a creature of habits, yet the 9th-year market remains like a second pulse beneath the wrist. When customers talked of harvests, I found myself listening for a far-off music. When I mended a gate, splinters in my thumb sang a different pain. Perhaps you know that feeling, when your life seems entirely accounted for. Yet one aisle in your heart refuses to be tallied. It is like finding sand in your shoe when you have never seen the sea. On a spring morning not long after, a wicker basket was left at the gap in the wall. Such things did not happen in Wall, where every loaf has a known oven and every child a known aunt. But there it sat, with a parcel's neatness and a card tucked beneath the cord. I was there by chance, though chance is the liar we employ when we fear the truth may claim the wages. The card bore my name in a hand both careful and strange. In the basket a baby lay sleeping, solemn as a bishop in his first sermon. His hair stood up like the meadow grass, and his tiny hand clutched what looked like a small glass flower without its chill. Having no wit left, I lifted him. I have lifted sacks of flour and crates of nails, but no weight compares to the lightness of a child when your name is written on his fate. I brought him home, and my wife looked from the baby to me, and I answered as best as a man answers when his past knocks at the door wearing a new face. We named him Tristan. In the house on our street, his laughter climbed the stairs. His tears pooled in my cupped hands. He learned to walk by hauling himself along the shop counter, scattering the measurements I had carefully arranged. In the evenings, after we shuttered the windows, my wife would tell him stories of kings who turned into rooks to escape death, and of rooks who turned into kings to discover it. I told Tristan the simpler things, such as how to tie a knot as if the rope were your word, and how to look at a field until you could see the shape of the wind. I did not tell him that the shape of his life had been drawn before he ever cried. I did not tell him of blue lamps and silver chains and a kiss that tasted like frost. There were days when I fancied I saw people in the lanes who did not belong to us. A man whose shadow had antlers in it. A woman whose reflection reached the puddle a moment before she did. Once, at dusk, a hare sat on our doorstep and looked at me with the calm of a magistrate. I told myself that men imagine things when they have more love than courage. Still, when Tristan stood by the gap and gazed at the meadow, hands behind his back as if listening for a far-off call, I felt the old ache return. A father desires safety for his child, as a roof desires rain. Safety is a roof that keeps out the stars as well as the storm. It is an honest shelter, and yet it blinds the eye to distances. If you have ever kept a secret for the sake of peace, you know how peace turns heavy when it is asked to carry the weight of truth. And life, well, life is stubborn and full of jokes. The boy's first tooth came in on the 9th night of the 9th month. He learned to whistle on a day when the wind would not. He climbed the wall once to the first ledge, and I spoke sharply and pulled him down, not because I feared he would fall, but because I feared he would not. My wife put her hand on my arm and said nothing, which is the strangest kindness a woman can show a man who has been a fool. Do not think we were unhappy. We had stew on the table and curtains that held the light like a blessing. On market days we laughed with the women who haggled like bards. On Sundays we sang, and if my voice slipped into a tune I had heard in another meadow, no one remarked it. Tristan grew straight and quick, with a habit of looking at the sky as if he were spelling it. I told him to fetch kindling, and he found driftwood in a landlocked lane. I asked him to sweep, and he drew a map of the world in the dust before he cleared it. Boys are like that. They do the thing you asked only afterward, and better in a way you did not expect. Yet the 9th year has a way of rounding the corner sooner than the 8th. Word of the fair began again in the hedges. Women planned their shawls, men counted their pennies, children ran their fingers over their dreams. I felt my heart loosen and tighten in the same breath. For it is a curious torment to love the boundary that keeps you safe and to love the breach that made you human. I am a man of wall. I am also the man who once bartered a kiss for a flower that would never wilt. The two facts do not make a contradiction, they make a life. But we still wonder whether a wall keeps danger out or keeps hunger in, and whether the truest safety is the kind that risks itself for something greater. Every village has its secrets. Every father has a story he hopes will end before it begins. Mine did not end. It opened like a gate. If you listen closely, you can already hear a star falling, a silver chain gone slack, a path murmuring beneath the feet of a boy whose name means sadness and will one day mean light. The kettle has stopped humming. The night leans closer. We will speak again of the market and of vows and of bargains that outlived the hands that made them. The year turned, as it always does, by the unnoticed labours of frost and sap, and the rumour of the market grew fat with repetition. A rumour is a village's second harvest. We put it up in jars of talk. We spread it on our bread of ordinary afternoons. I kept my hands busy with twine and oil and nails, but my ears did what ears do best when they remember a tune. Meanwhile, Tristan grew into the tallness his name had promised, all elbows and wonder, quick to blush and quicker to laugh, and already halfway out of every room he stepped into. I had the father's twin sensations of pride and foreboding, as if I were watching the last of a flock lift from a field, and could not tell whether they were going south or simply away. On the eve of the market, I took down the bell we hang above the shop door and polished it until the brass gave back a face I recognized and distrusted. We would be busy tomorrow. People from villages with humbler names than ours would wander through, buying lamp oil as if it could keep more than one kind of darkness at bay. My wife laid out the good cloth for the counter and baked a loaf that made the house smell like forgiveness. We did not speak of the meadow beyond the gap. Some subjects are like bees. Speak too loudly, and they will find you. Yet the bees came anyway. Tristan did not ask permission to go to the market. He asked for a clean shirt and for me to check a loose seam in his boot, and to borrow the better of our 2 combs. His mother fussed with his collar, which was to say she held on to him one last moment in a way the world would accept. He thanked her with a kiss that was too quick and came to me with the boot. I sewed in silence. Needles are honest things. They go in sharp and come out with a small mercy. He stood very still, and I thought of a night long ago when I had not stood still, and how some mercies are simply the bill that arrives years later with the printing smudged. The gap was watched as custom required by men whose beards told you more about their years than their eyes did. They let the villagers pass, and the field that is not a field made its old transformation. The air took on that flavour you can never quite name, like the first bite of a fruit you loved as a child and forgot as a man. Stalls rose like mushrooms after a rain. Musicians tuned instruments whose strings did not entirely trust wood and gut. A boy sold wind in coiled skeins, and if you listened, you heard a gale arguing with a sea it had not yet met. A woman displayed knives that cut away regret. I did not step past the gap. I stood near enough to see what I had seen before, and far enough that the past could not claim trespass. That is how Wall does its moral arithmetic. Tristan moved through that crowd with the gravity of a moth among candles, drawn and in danger of being singed. He found, as we all knew he would, the one lamp in the meadow whose flame he wanted as proof of himself, Victoria Forrester. You will forgive me a father's lack of objectivity. She was lovely in the way a well-made promise is lovely. There is a line between a village's pride and a village's vanity, and she walked it with the calm of someone who knows other people's knees will wobble before hers do. Tristan stood beside her with his hands behind his back, a schoolboy before a problem, and I saw him say something earnest and poor. She laughed, but not unkindly. The market made courtiers of us all. I could not hear his words over the clamour of a tinker trying to sell water that had once remembered being rain in another country. It was then that the sky enacted the old, strange courtesy it shows mortals on days when the world leans near. Far above us, where sheep do not graze and birds become equations, a bright thing unstitched from the night and began to fall. Many called it a star. A few corrected them and said it was a piece of one. A very few, who were not from Wall, held their breath as if to taste its name. The star fell across the meadow, across the fair, and across the faces of those who looked up, laying a silver road from our grass to some hill beyond our knowing. I have seen comets and lanterns and the tricks of showmen. This was not any of those. It was as if a bell were rung in a far chapel, and each heart struck its own small answer. Tristan looked at Victoria with the certainty that only youth and hunger can conjure, and I saw his mouth shape a vow. Later I would learn the form of it, that he would cross the meadow, cross the wall, cross whatever needed crossing, to bring her that fallen star. He believed in that minute that a star was a thing a man could pick up with the same hands that tie a knot or sweep a floor. If I tell you I moved to stop him, I would be polishing the truth to a shine it does not deserve. I did not stop him. Men do not arrest the very version of themselves they once were. We only pray that a later self will be waiting at the far end of the road to take the cloak from the earlier one's shoulders. Still, I did not leave him to his own story entirely. A father's vigil looks like idleness to everyone else. I returned to the shop, lit the lamp, and waited for him to come home, because he always had. Night drew itself over the village. The fair's music thinned to threads and finally to memory. The kettle sang its simple song. At last, near midnight, the bell over the door gave its small silver tongue, and Tristan came in with the look of a boy who has seen both the future and the bill for it. He sat at the counter, and I poured him tea, and the steam made an honest fog between us. He told me not everything, but enough. Victoria had laughed and said words that meant not yet, but maybe, and that perhaps a star, if a boy could fetch one, would persuade her to spend an evening listening to how he had done it. He described the line the star had carved in the sky and the map it had left in his chest. He asked to go beyond the wall. He asked it of me as if I were the wall or as if I were the meadow. The boy had my eyes, which is to say they were unreliable witnesses at moments like this. There are matters a father keeps in a drawer and opens only when the house is asleep. I opened that drawer and took out a candle. It looked ordinary, mean as tallow. Nothing of the blue lamps and silver chains clung to it. But it was not ordinary, as a letter is not ordinary when the seal bears a crest you pretend not to know. Word had drifted to me over the years of a thing called the Babylon Candle, which takes a man where he most desires to be while its flame lasts. Desire is a dangerous compass. It points not where true north lies, but where your heart insists the pole must be hammered into the earth. Still, the years had taught me that to forbid is to tempt, and to bless is to lighten. I placed the candle before him. "Light it only once," I said, "and only when you are sure." I did not say what I was sure of, which was that no one is ever sure. I did not tell him that the chain on a girl's ankle had been a chain on my heart. Nor did I tell him of a note tucked into a wicker basket, or of the debt a young man owes to the past. He created without knowing its shape. Instead, I showed him how to trim the wick, the way my father had shown me how to edge a blade. Practical advice is the truest prayer a father can offer. He touched the candle as if it were a small animal he did not want to startle. Then he leaned back and laughed at himself. The good, loud kind of laugh that pretends the world is simple and sometimes persuades it to be so for a minute. I laughed too. It is important to laugh in kitchens. It keeps the bread from going stale in the soul. Then we were silent, and the lamp marked the seconds on our faces. When he went up the stairs to his bed, he moved like a boy who had put on a coat with secret pockets. I lay awake beside my wife, listening to the village sleep. Somewhere a fox barked with the impatience of a messenger kept at a door. I thought of Una, who had once sat under a scarlet awning with a chain at her ankle, and had smiled at me with a courage I mistook for invitation. I wondered if the star had fallen near her. I wondered whether wishing to bring a star to a girl is any different from wishing to bring a mother to a son. Men say they wish for what they want. More often they wish for the wish to be answered, which is a subtler thing and harder to confess. But we still wonder whether a vow made under falling light keeps its strength when the light has left the sky, and whether love that begins with a challenge must always ask for proof. If you have ever made a promise that was too large for the room you were standing in, you know the feeling that came over me then. It is like trying to fold a map of the world back into its single page. In the morning we would walk to the gap. The old men with their staves would frown. The meadow would pretend not to be itself, and the story would do what stories do when they meet a door. It would knock, and something on the other side would answer with the sound of a bolt lifting. Morning always looks innocent, the way a child does before it learns its first clever lie. The sky over wall was rinsed clean, the hedges slick with dew, and the rooks already discussing matters above my jurisdiction. I brewed tea with more ceremony than necessary, as if steam could give backbone to what must be done. Tristan came down in the shirt his mother had ironed flat as a fresh page. He ate with the appetite of someone whose hunger is larger than bread. We did not speak about the candle. We spoke about the weather and the price of oats, and whether the bell over the door needed a firmer screw. Silence is a kind of rope. If you tie it carefully, it can hold a family together just long enough to carry it across a difficult ford. At the gap, the watchers stood as they had stood since my boyhood. 2 men, staves in hand, faces graven with the slow chisel of custom. The stones around the opening wore a gloss where palms had pressed for generations, asking and being denied. They nodded to me with the careful courtesy villagers reserve for one another when the matter at hand threatens to widen the lane into a road. One lifted his hand to stop Tristan. The other cleared his throat as if dislodging a century. Rules, he said without quite saying it, are the hinge on which safety swings. I had brought with me the thing I never meant to show, wrapped in oiled cloth, folded in an old ledger page, tucked into a pocket that had grown a memory. A note, left years ago in a wicker basket, written in a hand that made even my name look like a travelling song. I unfolded it and handed it across. The watcher read, blinked, read again. The words were simple, but they opened something in the air, as if a pin had been pulled from an invisible hinge. He looked at Tristan, then at me, then at the meadow that was already pretending not to be merely itself. His companion frowned at the stones, which offered no opinion. At last they stepped aside. Tristan looked back once. He did not smile. He did not speak. He did what young men do when the world has placed a hand on their shoulder and turned them toward the road. He went. He passed between the stones as if slipping between 2 lines in a book, and for a heartbeat I saw the air ripple around him, the way heat shivers above a blacksmith's plate. The meadow beyond brightened in a shade of green I do not know a mortal word for. He took 3 steps and vanished from the arithmetic of our side. A father learns to stand still where a boy cannot. I stood and let the minutes collect, like rain in a barrel. The watchers resumed their useful impersonation of statues. The village woke and went about its making do. I remained at the gap until noon, then until the colour of the light confessed that it was afternoon. At last, because a shop that is not open is soon a shop that is not, I returned to my counter, where metal and measure allowed me to pretend that life can be weighed and cut to size. It is a skill, and not a poor one, to carry on while your heart keeps watch elsewhere. I served customers, mended hinges, counted nails, and nodded at gossip that moved like ducks on a pond. All noisy surface. Underneath, the deeper water moved toward its own purpose. Every father knows this current. You keep your hands busy so that they do not reach for what they cannot hold. You find reasons to sweep the same corner twice. You tend the lamp before it grows dim. Between tasks, I found myself touching the pocket where the ledger paper had been. Ghosts will check their old rooms. Toward evening, a woman from up beyond the mill told me of a hare that crossed her path, and bowed as if in greeting. A weaver swore that the wind was braided on the common. A tinker said he had heard thunder while the sky lay untroubled as a tablecloth. Such reports come every 9th year like spores, settling wherever a mind is slightly damp. I listened more closely than politeness required. Each oddity was a small bell rung in some far chapel, and I counted them as if they might add up to a safe return. When the shop was dark and our supper eaten, I took out the candle and set it on the table between us. I told my wife what I had told her years before in another key, that a past misdeed had ripened into a present duty. She did not scold me. Her face went still in the way of sturdy women who have felt the floor tilt and know that the table must be cleared before anything else. She asked whether the boy had taken the candle. I said no, and that was both relief and worry. Desire is a map and also a ditch. If he had lit it from our kitchen, the flame would have carried him everywhere, except where patience might have taught him to walk. That night I slept in brief pieces, like a sentence broken by commas that refuses its period. Once I dreamed of the market, blue lamps, glass snowdrops, a silver chain gone slack. Once I dreamed of a hill with a bright thing upon it, and a girl sitting beside the brightness with her hand pressed to her side, looking at the sky as if accusing it of a slight. I woke with the taste of frost and iron. Dreams are unruly correspondence. They forward letters from rooms you cannot enter awake. At dawn I went again to the gap. The watchers eyed me with the weary compassion of doorkeepers who cannot follow those they permit. One said he had heard laughter on the wind, and then, a while later, a cry like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. He did not say whether either sound came from joy or pain. On such mornings, words do not volunteer to do more than their wage demands. I stood, and I imagined the other side. This is where I must change the measure of my voice, for there were scenes I did not witness and yet know. A father's knowing is a stubborn root. Beyond the gap, the hedgerows grow taller and stoop to listen. The ground remembers the weight of dances men were never invited to. Tristan, being himself, would have tried to fix the direction with the compass he carries in his chest. A vow, a star, a girl's face bright as a freshly polished coin. He would have walked until his breath filed a complaint, then walked further because stubbornness is a family resemblance. He would have learned quickly that distance is different there, that a mile can be coaxed to behave like a minute or a month, that a copse on a hill can take a day to walk around if your heart is not in agreement with your feet. And somewhere, perhaps on an evening when the sky had the exact colour of unspooled steel, he would have met a stranger who offered a direction dearer than maps, or a bargain dearer than coin. There is always a stranger when a story finds its second wind. I have been that stranger once. It is not a role I would recommend, unless you are prepared to live a long time with the echo of your own advice. Back in Wall, the ordinary continued its patient reign. I fixed a hinge for the schoolhouse door and showed a boy how to hold a file so that the metal sings rather than complains. I told a woman that a broom lasts longer if you hang it by its head. These are the little domestic wizardries that keep a village from fraying. If you are ever tempted to despise them, try living a week without any, and see what comes loose first, your shelves or your temper. On Sundays I sang, and sometimes the tune wandered toward a melody I could not name. No one minded. A village forgives a man who keeps good hours and pays his debts. Yet forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I kept the ledger that mattered most in my chest, adding small entries as news drifted to us in sideways fashion. A shepherd found a circle of ash in a field where no fire had been set. A girl from the next parish woke with a feather in her hair and a story she could not tell twice the same way. A peddler swore he had sold a pocket mirror to a woman whose reflection did not quite keep time with her. I tallied these things with the care of a man counting nails into a box, and in the margins I wrote the single word that covered all sums: hope. But we still wonder whether a door once opened ever closes again, without leaving its outline on the wall of the heart, and whether the guardians we trust are keeping the world out or the truth in. You may be thinking that a father's part is humble in a tale like this. It is. It is also necessary. Someone must tend the hinge while the door learns what it swings between. Someone must polish the bell, brew the tea, say the small practical words that keep a house aligned with the earth's turn. If you have ever waited at a window for a light you could not name, you understand the craft. You keep the fire, you mind the shop, you listen to the wind for laughter or for cries, and you promise yourself that when the latch lifts, you will be exactly here, ready to say only the right amount of welcome. Days grow their own habits, even when a life has been leaned suddenly toward its future. I opened the shop, trimmed the lamp, checked the cash drawer, and measured out nails in careful handfuls, as if the count itself could steady me. People came with small troubles that could be mended by objects, which is to say, troubles I understood. A hinge that sagged, a latch that stuck, a pan with a conscience of its own. I gave advice the way a priest gives blessings, and most of it worked, which is more than can be said of many benedictions. Yet every time the bell over the door rang, a piece of me looked up as if the sound might have followed a boy home across a country you cannot fold on any sensible map. News drifts to wall the way thistledown does, with a great deal of seeming aimlessness and a sly precision of destination. A drover passing through told of a streak of silver fallen toward the uplands, and of a woman glimpsed at twilight holding her side, sitting beside a brightness no eye could quite settle on. A peddler, with wrists tattooed in ink the colour of cold tea, claimed he had seen 3 sisters draw lots by candle, each flame bending toward the eldest as if in a wind no one else could feel. He said they were searching for a heart, and he tapped his own chest and grinned the way a man grins when he has an appetite and no dinner. I did not say his story matched too neatly the kind of tales a market tells about itself every 9th year. I paid him for 2 lengths of cord, and watched him swagger away as if the road had tipped in his favour. That night I dreamt I was a key hanging on a nail, and that the door I might fit was walking away on the feet of a boy, with my eyes. I woke to the plain proof of a roof overhead, and my wife sleeping like a calm ship at anchor. Morning is a good antidote to portent, but not a cure. I swept the step, the bristles writing their small common poem on stone. A child from the northern lane came to ask if I had oil for a lantern, and I asked in return whether his mother still baked barley cakes on Tuesdays, for to speak of Tuesdays is to make a treaty with fate. Not today. By noon, a tinker I had not seen before wheeled his cart to our door. He had a face that looked as if it had been folded and refolded by weather until the lines knew one another by name. He set out curios with the brisk pride of a man who believes in what he sells because he has seen it misbehave. Among the brazen trivets and jars of buttonbacks, a glass snowdrop winked. Its petals were veined delicately as frost near a window latch. I did not reach for it. Touch is treacherous in the presence of memory. The tinker said nothing for a time, and then he said that sometimes a flower is a message that refuses to be read aloud. I told him I liked things that did their work openly. He nodded as if I had passed a small test, and sold me instead a length of wire and a notion that the world had a sense of humour. The gatekeepers at the Gap told me in their evening lottery of gossip that a hare had sat upon the stones at noon as if presiding, and that later a raven had flown backward against a wind that the hedges did not acknowledge. When men with staves begin to report strangeness with the matter-of-fact tone they reserve for rainfall and toothache, you may be sure the other side of the wall is taking a long breath. They also mentioned, more cautiously, a woman beyond the Gap who wore a chain of silver as if it were a ribbon, and who bargained like a person accustomed to measuring the worth of hours. Her name they could not agree on. Names are frequently the last truth to enter a room. I began to write at odd hours a letter I did not expect to deliver. I put down the plainest things first, as a man will when he is shy of the larger truth. How to use a whetstone properly. How to judge bread by its sound when you thump the crust. The reason you always coil a rope the same way you did the first time you learned its moods. Then, between such domestic scriptures, I added the items no father knows how to say aloud, without turning sentiment into a cudgel. Do not confuse grand gestures with devotion. Tend to small mercies as if they were wells. When you must choose a direction, choose the one that allows you to leave the door unlocked behind you. A letter is a craftsperson's prayer. You build it so it might outlast any weather between two hearts. What I knew, or thought I knew, of Tristan's path kept arriving crookedly, as if the news itself disliked our side's habit of straight lines. Someone spoke of a little hairy man who traded directions for patience. Someone else, returning from the uplands with wool that made the fingers remember winter, said she had heard a girl's voice arguing with the stars themselves, impertinent and brave. There was mention of a candle that, once lit, carried a soul where yearning points, and of a boy who learned that the shortest path is the one that begins by standing very, very still. These are details you will recognize if you have ever let longing do your geometry. I went once more to the meadow's lip and found there a scrap of ribbon caught on hawthorn, pale as a moonrise. I freed it with the piety a man keeps for the past, and the thorn caught my thumb, drawing a dot of blood polite as punctuation. A breeze rose and said nothing useful. The stones of the wall remained their dependable, uninterested selves. I imagined what lay on the far side. A hill with a bright fall of silver settled upon it like a guest who does not yet know whether she will stay. a young woman beside it, hand to her side, thinking uncharitable thoughts about gravity. A boy arriving late to a conversation that had been waiting for him since before he could find his own feet. We want to believe such arrivals are tidy. They are not. They are the true beginning of the work. In the shop, I found myself repairing a toy windmill for a child whose father worked the mill proper, and came home each evening with flower on his sleeves, like a courtier wearing lace to please a queen. The toy's sails had cracked. I bound them with thread and a sliver of hope, and told the boy the wind would know what to do next. He looked at me as if the wind and I were in correspondence. Children have a talent for promoting you to offices you did not run for. I also hung the broom by its head, scolded the bell's tongue for ringing when the door had not opened, and oiled the latch so its complaints grew courteous. These are the little repairs by which a man keeps despair from drafting him. A farmer from the South Path came in late and whispered of princes gathering at a crossroads. No map allows, each with a fragment of an old topaz. No hand could fully enclose, each watched by the mild, relentless company of dead brothers who would not leave the game unrefereed. He laughed at himself after, as if to shake a story loose, but the laughter had a burr in it. Power has its own weather. You can smell the change before the sky turns. But we still wonder whether the things we hear when the world leans close are warnings or invitations, and whether our hearts can tell the difference in time to choose the wiser door. At supper I told my wife about none of it, and all of it in the language of long-married people who have learned to let silence carry the freight truth might spill. She poured stew and spoke of cabbage as if it were a theory of justice. I refilled her cup and said that the day had been busy in the way that keeps a man from growing too proud of his thoughts. We smiled the old conspiratorial village smile that says the world is larger than the lane, and also that someone still has to see to the washing up. Then I went to the window and stood a while, listening to the kind of night that collects itself carefully, as if laying out tools for the work of dawn. If you have ever waited, you know the sport fate plays with watches. Minutes grow tall and thin. Hours sit short and stubborn. You learn the art of laying one task beside another until they make, together, a passable bridge. So I counted nails. I labelled jars, I copied a column of numbers twice, and the second time, prettier. I sharpened a pencil to its best, particular point. It is possible to reach across great distances with such small rights. It is possible to become, for a while, the hinge that does not mind which way the door swings, so long as it swings true. There is a particular hush that settles on a house when a boy has gone toward his promise. It is not silence. The kettle still ticks as it cools. The chair still complains when you lean back too far. The sparrows still hold their morning parliament under the eaves. But over and under these small fidelities, there is a stillness like snow deciding where to fall. I kept shop as a man keeps watch, and the village conspired to help. People brought me errands in which patience was the chief material. Mend this handle, they said, though the wood is tired of being itself. Straighten this nail, though it remembers having once been bent. Measure me a yard of twine, though I have not yet decided what to tie. I obliged them all and thanked them secretly for their collusion with my waiting. I will speak plain. From here my voice must sometimes widen to the measure of knowledge a father claims without proofs. It is not magic, only the arithmetic of love. A man knows when his child has stood on a height and found the world both larger and nearer than he had ever guessed. Beyond the gap, the track grew more itself with each step Tristan took. Hedges leaned in to eavesdrop, crows pronounced opinions. He met, on a bend where the road forgot the difference between going and coming, a small, hairy man who had the look of a person fashioned out of thistle and good humour. The little man traded directions for patience, or perhaps patience for directions. Those coins are minted in the same imperial mint. He taught the boy how to listen for a path with his feet, and how to fix a destination not by sight, but by wanting. And when Tristan, being young and full of vows, confessed the shape of his wish, the little man nodded in the manner of an elder craftsman who sees a raw timber worth the trouble. The star, meanwhile, lay on a green hill not far as the heart measures, farther as the miles do. She had fallen hard. I say she because that is the truth the old tales pretend to forget, and boys do not imagine until they are corrected by astonishment. Her name was Yvain. She held her side as if the sky had left a shard in her. The light around her was not a light for seeing by, it was a light that remembered. I have once held a glass snowdrop that kept the chill of winter in its fragile skin. Yvain's light was like that, bred of distances and old songs. She was contemptuous of gravity and of promises made under its brief spectacle, but she was human in the way pain is persuasive. She needed healing or a companion or both, and there are hours when those two goods are the same thing under different names. Tristan reached her on that hill. Whether he lit the Babylon candle then or later, whether the flame licked him across fields in a single breath, or he went by the plodding geometry of steps, I cannot swear. Fire is a complicated witness. What I know is that he arrived, and that he looked not merely with his eyes, but with the entire map of reasons he had walked so far. He had imagined a bright stone that could be wrapped and carried like a gift, one brings to a village girl as proof of seriousness. Instead, he found a person who did not intend to be proof of anything. This is the first severer education most boys receive. He told her what he meant to do. She told him what he would not. Between these two nations, a treaty would have to be negotiated. He would have had, from some friend or stranger, a silver chain with polite magic in it, a binding not meant to bruise. In fairy, such things are as common as rope and as particular as a name. He used it awkwardly at first, not as a jailer, but as a man trying to keep his promise to a girl back in wall without quite understanding that one promise often contradicts another. Yvain, sore and indignant, despised him, and then, being practical like any creature who has fallen a long way, allowed the bargain time to unfold. They set out from the hill with the sky a little emptier overhead, and the land regarding them with the mischief of a host who likes to see what guests are made of. Back on our side, I kept the clock honest and the lamp trimmed. A woman brought me a cracked blue jug, and asked whether a mend would hold water and memory both. I told her to pour slowly for a fortnight and see which leaked first. My wife scolded the cat for showing a professional interest in Sunday chickens. I taught a boy the better way to coil rope, so it will wish to unspool in your hand rather than fight you like a small, stubborn river. These were not great deeds. They were proof that the world keeps house while the story climbs its hills. Word of other players came the way it always comes to Wall, by rumour with the dust of other roads upon it. Someone heard of 3 elderly women who were never seen together, and yet were always seen in accord, haggling in the kind of arithmetic that counts backward to youth. The eldest was said to wear her age like a dress that could be let out or taken in with a single stitch. They wanted a heart, not metaphor, a true, warm, beating thing, which in their calculus would purchase long years and returning beauty. You will say, this is an unkind way to be old. I say merely that some appetites age into their own reasons. There were princes abroad too, or the after-echoes of princes, which does as well when the living are at their most ambitious. The topaz of Stormhold, thrown by an old lord into the sky the night the star fell, had become a lodestone for ambition. Dead brothers watched and advised in the courtly way the dead prefer, with the patience of stones and the relish of men who no longer have a stake except in the outcome. An entire realm leaned toward an answer. In Wall we made soup and mended fences. Yet you felt if you put your hand against the air as you might place it on a horse's flank that the great beast of fortune had lifted its head. Tristan and Yvain went a little in company and a little at angles, as any 2 creatures do who are travelling together toward different proofs. He learned courtesy one day and forgot it the next, as is the way of courtesy when it must share a pack with hunger. He learned also to make a fire that burned blue as if the night had lent a piece of itself, and to tell whether the silence around them was the silence of rest or of attention. She learned that a human boy can be accidentally kind, and that he will walk beside pain without demanding payment for his patience. At night she glowed whether she wished to or not, and sometimes in the dark he looked at her and thought not of prizes, not of proofs, but of a quietness he had not felt since he was 5, and the world was made of 3 rooms and a door. Once, in the hedges near the south pasture, I found a feather that was not a bird's argument with the wind, so much as the memory of having been far above weather. I held it and understood nothing more for having done so, which is often the honest result of a relic. I varnished a chair, mended a latch, counted copper, and kept my mouth shut when men at the alehouse spoke too loudly about things no man on our side can know. If I am making myself sound wise, forgive me. I was only busy, and busy looks a little like wisdom from the front pew. From the back pew, it looks like survival. You will ask how a father bears the knowledge that his son is walking inside a rumour with teeth. The answer is that he sharpens the tools he can hold. I sharpened mine. I wrote in my undeliverable letter the small, exact things every boy must learn from someone. How to tell when bread is ready by its voice, why you never leave a knife pointing at a door, how to help a companion off the ground in a way that lends dignity as well as leverage. I added between such instructions the dangerous truth that a heart is not a possession but a province, and that the maps for it are drawn in a language you must learn as you go. On an evening like any other, the gatekeepers told me they had heard distant music above the hedge, a throb and a beat that made the air itself feel drummed upon. Later, a shepherd swore he had seen a ship sailing a storm that was not in our sky, its crew laughing like men given a second youth. These things are the embroidery the world does when it wants the cloth to keep the eye. I folded them into my waiting. But we still wonder whether a quest begun to prove worth can transform into a journey to learn it, and whether the star we chase changes us more by refusing to be owned than by letting herself be caught. I say again, we were not miserable in Wall. I varnished the counter until it threw back a version of my face I could stand to greet. My wife kept beans in jars like small obedient planets and taught a neighbour's child to knead dough by listening. The cat retired from chicken work and took up window inspection. On Sundays, the hymn settled on the congregation like a shawl someone's grandmother might have knit out of summer evenings. In such weather of days, a man's heart can go on holding a distant hill and a boy on it without splitting. This is the common miracle of villages and of fathers who sweep their floors as if the dust were the ash of stars, and must be treated with care. And far away, not so far as fate measures, a boy and a fallen star went on together, the one learning that promises can be heavier than packs, and the other learning that walking beside a human is a cure for certain kinds of loneliness. The chain between them slackened into conversation. Their shadows discovered how to agree on length. The night paid them attention and did not always charge for it. The story, which had left our house by the door, wrote back with no address, and still I read it as if it had been placed on our mat by a considerate hand. Some mornings arrive already carrying news, though no messenger has crossed your threshold. The air itself feels thumbed, as if someone far away has turned a page you meant to read next. On such a morning I opened the shop, laid out nails in orderly rows, and found that none of them would stay put. They slid the way thoughts do when the mind keeps looking up. Outside, the lane smelled of damp stone and fresh baking. Our neighbour had set loaves to rise and left the window ajar so the whole street might be cheered by the prospect of crust. I tell you these homely things because they are the raft a man clings to when the tide of wonder begins to lift under his door. Word came in scraps, which is often the only honest way it comes. A shepherd boy swore he had heard thunder sown with laughter, yet the sky above Wall was a clean blue pocket. A pedlar described a rope dropped through a cloud, as if heaven had mislaid its washing. A woman passing from the mill told of light moving behind daylight, a silver-footed brightness that stepped where birds do not. I listened and kept my face sensible. Inside, something in me leaned like a weathercock. Beyond the gap, where hedges stoop to gossip and distances practice tricks, a small decision can run ahead of your feet and arrive before you do. Tristan Hunger, making a north in him that no compass could correct, took out the candle I had taught him to trim, the drab little thing whose flame is a door that opens onto your wanting. He meant, perhaps, to whisk himself and the star toward a wall to lay astonishment at a girl's feet like a bouquet whose price would be counted later. But fire is a translator that favours truth. He lit it thinking of home, and found, with the rude benevolence by which the world tutors the young, that the shortest path from a promise to its keeping is not the path back, but the path further on. The flame leapt, and space composed itself differently, obliging desire's grammar. The earth stepped aside. I did not see it with my own eyes, yet I know it all the same. A sudden, cool wind, the world tilting like a pitcher, the smell of felted cloud and iron. For an instant, he and Yvain were nowhere a map admits, held in the bright pause between places. Then the flame went out as all mercies do, lest we grow lazy, and the two of them hung in the sky's sleeve, which is not a place designed for boys or for stars, who have only just remembered the weight of bones. This is where rumour and probability reach an agreement. A ship that never touches harbour except to taste it, sails sewn with brass threads to coax lightning from hiding, a crew who laugh as if they had been forgiven something large such a vessel was out hunting in a weather the rest of us could not taste. The captain was a burly rumour inside a man, with the peculiar kindness of those who must occasionally frighten the world to keep their trade plausible. He welcomed the two odd passengers with a politeness that had rope burns on it, asked few questions, and set to teaching the boy the only magic a ship truly trusts: knots, timing, attention. I have tied a fair number of knots in my time. A good knot is a compact between patience and purpose. Tristan learned the bowline and the clove hitch, the highwayman's knot and the simple bend that makes two lines behave as if they had been born to one another. He learned how to step when the deck insists on thinking other thoughts, and how to keep a hand free for the rail, because pride is not a harness. He learned the sailor's arithmetic of storms, the way you count from flash to thunder, and then remember that distance is a negotiator, not a law. I know this because back in Wall I found my hands tying loops in string for no reason at all, and because the bell over the shop door rang in a rhythm that matched the old songs men sing when they lower a kite into the teeth of a sky. Yvain nursing her hurt side, and the larger pain of having been torn from the high loneliness that had always hidden her from loneliness of every other kind, glowed sullenly at first. A star in daylight is a secret annoyed at being kept. Yet night after night, when the crew drummed a beat onto the boards to tease lightning down, her light answered, small and steady, not the thing they chased, but a reminder of why chasing is a respectable folly. There must have been a moment, no one can say, when she looked at the boy who had bound her with a silver chain, and saw not a jailer, but an apprentice to his own heart, learning the craft the hard way, and the chain, which had been a line drawn between them, slackened into a story they were telling together. In our kitchen, I caught myself counting to 7 between the flash of the lamp's reflection on the kettle and the soft strike of the bell as someone came in. I found a scorch on the back step shaped very much like a knot. I had not tied since I was young. My wife laughed at me for stirring the stew clockwise 3 times, as if I had signed a contract. Lighter matters insisted on their turn. A jar of buttons I sorted by no useful principle. The cat leaping into a square of sunlight as if auditioning for a small role in a happy dream, a neighbour's child solemnly appointing me judge in a dispute between 2 toy soldiers. For a full minute I pronounced on the law regarding tin. Not all the sky's news was generous. The ship, for all its laughter, must have learned to frown. You cannot go about teasing lightning without also attracting attention. There are eyes in that country that notice light the way hawks notice movement. The eldest of 3 terrible sisters had tasted the years growing thin, and knew the recipe by which to add to them. She required a heart full of star. If this sounds cruel, set it beside any ledger of ambition in either world and tell me the figures look stranger than usual. She left her house with the kind of briskness that makes even goats walk smarter, and glamours fell from her hands like well-folded linen. Somewhere below the ship's merry-sounding weather, wheels turned. A black carriage sought a road no parish surveyor would claim, and the world made ready to offer the travellers a rest that would not be rest. I once mended the signboard for the inn on our north lane. The ring creaked where the sign hung, and the wind enjoyed its mischief. While I planed the edges and tightened the hook, I thought of how a sign promises shelter before the door has done its work. There is a kind of trap that begins with kindness and ends with arithmetic. The traveller is shown a fire for his cold bones, and a chair for his ache, and, at last, a bed that understands how easily sleep and surrender confuse themselves. I do not say this to frighten you, I say it to honour how often the right door and the wrong door wear the same paint. If the boy and the star came down from the cloud road at an inn that was not an inn, they would have been greeted by warmth that overspoke itself, by a smile that counted, by tea that remembered too much of the leaves. The star would have felt pain tug in her side with new intention. The boy would have set his hand on the chain in apology rather than authority, because even a foolish lad learns to say, "Forgive me," before he knows the full cost of having learned the words. And a stranger, courteous as daylight, would have offered them rest while sharpening a very quiet knife made not of metal but of purpose. Back at the gap, the watchers told me they had heard a single peal of bells one afternoon, and then nothing, as if the air itself had decided to hold its breath. I tightened the screws on the bell over our shop door, and found I could not account for why my hands shook. I walked the village in a tidy loop, admiring my neighbour's roses with exaggerated interest. I bought 2 apples from a cart simply to exchange coins for weight. I wrote in my undeliverable letter the plainest counsel I knew. When the chair is too soft, stand up. When the fire is too eager, step back. When a stranger insists you must be tired, ask yourself who proposes to profit by your sleeping. But we still wonder whether the quickest road home is ever the one that truly brings us back, and whether safety offered too swiftly is only a fairer name for surrender. That evening, my wife and I ate bread so fresh it scolded the knife for its impatience. The cat resisted the urge to chase a moth and lost with dignity. I set the glass in the cupboard in rows that made their own small logic. The world, faithful in its details, kept me company, while the larger story tangled its ropes above the reach of my hands. Somewhere a ship made of thunder's scrap lumber let down a ladder. Somewhere a coachman flicked his whip, and a wheel found a stone that remembered other wheels. Between such somewheres, a boy and a fallen star travelled like a question that refuses to end with the easy answer. There is a sort of kindness that is only the preface to appetite. Villagers know this, though we usually apply the wisdom to foxes and lenders. I thought of it that week each time a customer praised the neatness of my jars, or the way the bell over my door had exactly the right sort of ring. Praise can be a soft rope if you let it coil. I kept my hands busy and my answers plain. All the while news feathered in, thistledown with a memory for the right garden. A carter swore the hill beyond the hedge had put on a shape it did not own the day before, a tidy house with warm panes and a smell of sugared tea. He said the path to it felt shorter while you walked and longer when you turned back. A shepherdess, Ria's weather, told me she had seen a young woman by that same door hold her side the way a person holds a fragile cup, and that the air around her had a quiet about it, not made by silence. Another voice, lower, said there was an older woman near the porch, with the courtesy of someone who knows exactly how you like your comfort, and exactly why you will be a fool for accepting it. You do not need a map to see the trap drawn there. On our side, I mended the schoolroom latch and put a better edge on the chisel the carpenter pretends is young. I spoke to a boy about knots, because ever since my hands taught string a new cleverness, I have trusted rope to understand human stubbornness. A good knot will hold you and not humiliate you when you untie it. I told him that, and tried not to hear the echo of a chain that had been slackening somewhere beyond the gap. When a father speaks, he hears the other side of his own words, as if a second craftsman were testing the joints. Meanwhile, the fair tales that were not fair tales continued to petition our mornings. Men with staves at the gap heard a single-wheeled carriage roll past without leaving ruts, the sure sign of a vehicle with too much intention. The older of the watch said he had seen a goat look him full in the face and bite a thistle like a gentleman eating cress. He laughed at himself after, but he described the goat's eyes too exactly to make the story harmless. These things were annotations on a page already written. The three ancient sisters, counting their remnants of youth and deciding subtraction, would no longer do. The princes of Stormhold travelling by rumour and calculation toward a jewel whose light would choose a king, and, between them, a boy and a fallen star approaching a door that had been made for them as surely as a snare is made for the fox who has just learned to trust the scent of eggs. Yvain came to that door, because pain makes even the wary accept a chair. The boy came because vows persuade the young that rest is only a debt that must be paid to the body before honour continues its march. The house promised warmth and put fire to the promise like a signature. A kettle sang. A bed threw its shadow like a suggestion. The woman who waited there wore years with the briskness of one who expects to take them off like a cloak. She set tea on a tray, and the steam curled in letters a human throat cannot read. She offered an apple with the innocent wickedness of gardens, a meat pie with a fragrance that argued persuasively against doubt, a little knife not yet taken from its sheath, the better not to trouble the air with honesty too soon. I did not see what followed, but the mind fits wood to wood when it has been long in the trade. A star's heart is a different thing than yours or mine. Cut it, and the years of a witch reorder themselves as if time were a clerk instructed to carry sums forward. The eldest sister knew this with the professional cheerfulness of a butcher discussing a fine joint. She kept her voice sweet and her hands near what mattered. The boy who had tied haze and thunder into ropes on a ship above weather did not yet know how to refuse hospitality that struck all the right notes. If you have ever let weariness do your choosing, you know the arithmetic that began to add itself there. The world, which has some sport left in it, sent a correction dressed in myth. A white creature with the hard grace of a river in winter came horn first into the story and changed the total. Call it a unicorn, for men must use the names they inherit, though the thing itself did not require our syllables to be true. It disliked lies. It disliked knives that had been too patient. It disliked the kind of kindness that is merely a polite path to theft. In a room where comfort had been arranged like an argument, it was an objection the size of a door. Where the witch set sweetness, it set speed. Where she set a pillow, it set its hoof. Yvain, who had learned in her fall that help sometimes puts on improbable shapes, touched its mane, and was believed. Tristan had walked in the world of clouds long enough to feel. When goodness goes missing from a room, perhaps a knot he had left, easy tightened all by itself in his pocket. Perhaps the wind tutored him. He came back in time to see courtesy turning into arithmetic, and for once he did not try to pay with explanation. Boys who have been sailors learn a few things quickly, including how to make distance honest in a hurry. He took hold of Yvain with the simple expertise of a man who has hauled line and will not shame the rope by wasting it. If there was a candle left to him, even a fragment, he used it to shove the room's walls farther apart. More likely, he used what men forget to count: his feet, his fear, and the fact that he had finally begun to know the difference between a promise you give a girl to be praised and a promise you make to a person because she is in front of you and needs leaving undone. The house showed its true shape then, as such traps always do when the first attempt fails. Warmth became a draught with teeth in it. Lamps looked like eyes that had learned to blink. Music admitted it had been humming under compulsion. The polite knife lost its patience and said its real name. It was not enough. Kindness with a horn is louder than hunger with a plan. The unicorn carved away into distance and shouldered the star's hurt without asking for thanks. Tristan, whose courtesy had been practicing all this time for its first real day of work, helped without commanding. He did not once reach for the chain. Back in Wall, a woman bought a length of blue ribbon and insisted it must be cut just so, because it was for a parcel that would go far. I measured twice and cut once, and the scrap left over looked to me like a shape on a hill where silver pools. I pretended it was nothing. I trimmed the bell's tongue and pretended I had misheard earlier its single toll as afternoon leaned. I copied a column of figures for the shop and found myself writing a name in the margin that was not a village name. Then I walked to the gap and listened. Hedges speak when the wind persuades them. That day they said only that the old law holds. Not all doors are made of wood, not all gates are made of iron. And the true threshold is where a heart chooses. A peddler from nowhere in particular brought me a bit of news like a button in his pocket. 2 princes had passed the same crossroad within hours of each other, each with something of an old topaz tucked into a glove. The older had a carriage and a driver with thoughtful hands. The younger had the genius of men who wait. One of them left the road alive to enter a bathhouse whose tiles remembered better days. The other left the bathhouse alive to enter a future that would be contested more than once. The dead brothers, of course, were seen where they prefer to stand, just to the side of choice, noticing. There is a decency about the dead in stories. They will watch the game to its end, even if they cannot play another hand. Meanwhile, the 3 sisters set new lots to burning, and watched the flames bend like servants asked a question. The eldest's look sharpened. Her cheek briefly forgot a wrinkle. Time, feeling hopeful, stood straighter. There would be another attempt, for appetite is a craftsman that never loses interest in improvement. The road ahead for the boy and the star would be crossed more than once by a generosity that was really a purchase order. But we still wonder whether rescue teaches us more than peril, and whether the help we accept changes us more than the harm we escape. That night I oiled the hinge on our back door until it learned to hold its peace. My wife set out 2 bowls, then 3, then 2 again. In that unconscious way hands rehearse welcome. The cat found an old sunbeam and made it new. I wrote a single line in the letter no post will carry. When someone offers you rest, ask your tiredness to answer last. Then I banked the fire, listened to the lane exhale, and imagined hooves that do not slip, a horn bright with objection, and a boy who had just discovered that the right thing, when it comes, asks no speech and abides no delay. The morning after, the watchers at the gap swore they had heard bells when there were none. The lane wore a washed look, as if the night had laundered it and hung it up to dry. I opened the shop. The bell gave its good, ordinary note. Men came for nails that agreed to be counted. Women asked for oil to keep lamps from sulking. I measured, weighed, scribbled figures, and kept the greater arithmetic in my chest. A father learns to live at 2 registers, the one where coins clink, and the other where every leaf that turns in the wind sounds like news from far away. News there was, in slivers. A farmer said he had found a hoofprint in a meadow where no horse walks, and it shone a little when rain stood in it. A girl swore a pale creature with a single horn had bowed its head beside a hill and let a bright, hurting girl lean against its neck. A peddler with a clean tongue for gossip described a house that had been soft as cake the day before and bare ground the day after, leaving behind only the smell of sugar that had learned remorse. I polished the counter as men do when they do not wish to show their hands are shaking. Beyond the gap, Tristan and Yvain went on, the one stitched to the other by necessity that had been promoted, quietly, to care. The unicorn, thinking no grand thoughts about rescue, simply disliked false doors and knives that had waited too long, and trod where paths kept their word. They travelled under skies that knew the 2 kinds of night, the ordinary velvet and the other kind that glows from within, because a fallen star cannot quite agree to be dark. When Yvain's side ached, the creature slowed. When Tristan's courage did, it did not. His hand went to the chain fewer times. His apologies began to arrive before his mistakes. There are such promotions in a boy's life that no bell announces. The road in Fairy is a negotiator. It offers you a straight line, only to hide the price in the small print. So it bent, as roads do when there is a lesson around the corner. Along it came a cart, whose wheels agreed too easily with the ruts, and a woman whose eyes totted up the world as if it were a ledger in which youth and years might be traded in tidy columns. Ditchwater Sal, people call her on our side, and that name tastes of stale tea and old spells. I had once seen her hand on a silver chain, and I did not forget. Her magic, liar and lawyer both, is the sort that chooses what it does not wish to see. She looked at the boy and saw a tired kindness she could make use of. She looked at the star, and, by virtue of a charm that does not bear close inspection, failed to see what would have undone her appetite. In such a world, blindness is not a misfortune, it is a policy. What passed between them I learned later in the way fathers do, by inference and by the fit of consequences. She offered a ride, and a bargain that grew sensible if you were sore and hungry. He accepted for the same reasons a decent man accepts a chair after he has been brave. The unicorn stamped at the roadside, insulted by arithmetic pretending to be courtesy. Yvain, bound by human pain and human hope, allowed the fiction of safety a little time to speak. It nearly said its piece, but Sal's glamour, for all its cleverness, could not make the world entirely agree to be misread. A glint here, a wince there, a shadow that refused to behave such refusals are the allies of the good, when the good are weary. In wall, I sharpened a chisel for the carpenter and taught the vicar's small nephew the honest difference between a reef knot and a granny knot. He tied the wrong one twice and laughed like someone who has found a way to like his mistakes before mending them. The cat stalked a biscuit crumb as if it were a heron, then sneezed dignity onto the rug. My wife set beans to soak in a row of blue bowls, and their plain patience steadied me as well as any prayer. I make you a catalogue of small mercies, because they are how men remain useful while the larger wheels turn elsewhere. Wheel they did. The princes of Stormhold had narrowed, as ambition does by attrition. Primus, who loved hot water and careful plans, discovered too late that a woman's bath can steam with more than comfort. Septimus, patient as frost, counted moves left on the board, and found that the topaz flung skyward by an old lord the night a star fell, now kept its own counsel, and had begun to lean toward an answer. The dead brothers stood in their mild, merciless gallery, and made remarks. The gem would name a king. A kingdom does not like to be kept waiting, nor do old women who have decided to be young again. Word reached me on the wind's thin paper. The eldest witch had taken note of the unicorn's interference, and those who stand in kitchens long enough to hear the weather change knew that her politeness would return sharpened. I put away the good cheers the way a man puts away speech when it would make a day worse. I walked to the gap and said nothing to the watchers. They nodded back with the compassion of men who hold a rule that sometimes pinches the hand. From the hedges came only the thoughtful silence of things that know how to keep counsel. On the other side, the cart and its driver, innocence made into a business plan, carried the travellers as far as bargains allow. The unicorn refused to step under the shadow of any deceitful tree. Tristan began, perhaps for the first time, to ask of every comfort a single question. Who profits by my ease? He did that good arithmetic, and when it embarrassed him, he kept doing it. Yvain watched and did not say what she already understood. Stars fall with a pride that is really solitude in armour. They rise with the help of creatures who do not require speeches. The chain between her and the boy had learned to lie slack, and slackness, which looks like negligence, is sometimes the first letter in the alphabet of trust. A skyship had taught the boy how laughter conducts weather, and how a knot conducts intention. A horn had taught him how objection can be kinder than consent. Now a witch-woman taught him the price of not reading the small print on kindness. Lessons have a way of travelling in packs. He gathered them with both hands, as a workman gathers tools, not because he wished to brandish them, but because sooner or later the day will ask, and it is well to have an answer that fits. At the shop I wrote 3 lines in the letter no post will carry. Do not be the first to sit. Do not be the last to leave. When someone keeps offering you exactly what you have not asked for, look to your own pockets. Then I turned the paper over and wrote a 4th. What you think is a detour may be the road correcting your map. The road did correct it. South and east of places that will not admit to their names, Tristan and Yvain left the cart behind and took again to walking and to the unicorn's steady measure. An old stone by the path showed a mark the air remembered. Distance shortened once, then lengthened twice, the way it does when 2 pursuers set their clocks to your steps. Septimus listened to the topaz as if it were a wife who had decided at last to speak plainly. The eldest sister breathed on a mirror until it remembered when it was river. Her glamour polished itself. Her patience grew a razor. Back in Wall, the ordinary day was beautiful with ignorance. I sold 2 pounds of nails to a farmer who had decided correctly that a fence is a form of prayer. I mended a sieve for a widow and told her the truth about patched things. They do not lie to you, and that is worth a little ugliness. I swept the threshold and found a white hair too coarse for any creature I keep. I did not save it. Not everything must be kept to be believed. Evening fell with its thrift of light. The hymn at vespers held the village like a basket. If I sang a note that did not belong to our tune and belonged to one I had heard above the clouds, no one minded. But we still wonder whether a charm that blinds a heart to what matters can be undone by the simplest sight of all, and whether the road that bends us is only trying to make our steps belong to one another. Night gathered its tools. The kettle sang in our kitchen. My wife put her hand over mine in that way that is both a question and an answer. I thought of a star who had learned to walk at a human pace, and of a boy who had begun to keep his promises to the person in front of him, rather than to the echo of a dare. Somewhere, a gemstone finished remembering who it ought to shine for. Somewhere else, a witch decided that the next kindness would be the last one required. In between, hooves declined to hurry, a chain forgot to be iron, and the air over a road leaned to hear 2 travellers speaking without quite knowing yet that their voices were already choosing a home. By the time apples came down in price, and mornings carried that thin, metallic cool you taste before true autumn, I had learned to conduct an entire day with my hands, while the heart listened elsewhere. I sold hinges that promised fidelity to doors, advised against nails too proud for their boards, and found the right tin for a woman who kept saffron for show and sage for use. The village went about the business. Villages are founded to do, make weather into meals, and time into stories we can bear. And yet the air itself wore a rumour, as if someone were turning the world's great page with a gloved hand. Beyond the wall, where hedges consult and distances keep their own counsel, the road reunited its scattered intentions. The unicorn's breath steadied. Yvain's light, a little dimmer with pain and prudence, kept to a modest glow, and Tristan, me boy, grown longer of limb and a little shorter of speech, walked with the plain competence of someone who has hauled line in high wind and learned which knots answer and which only argue. He touched the chain less. When he did, it was the sort of touch that means pardon me rather than you must. There is a difference. Even the hawthorns noticed. Stories are social. They invite other stories to call. So the princes came nearer, reduced now to the two who had learned to endure subtraction. Primus, who liked his water hot and his plans tidy, travelled with a carriage and the sort of driver who can steer two horses and a secret at the same time. Septimus, cold as the north face of a church and patient as winter, moved by calculation and the quiet delight of a man who means to be the last voice at table. The topaz of Stormhold had begun to choose. It leaned the way iron leans toward lodestone, and every path bent a little to let ambition pass. And because hunger never attends alone, the eldest of the three grey women, polite in the manner of shopkeepers, and storms laid her road like a ribbon. She raised an inn where yesterday there had been damp hillside, an establishment with windows that gave back a flattering version of whoever looked in. Weary travellers saw competence. Hurried men saw a delay that felt like prudence. Hunters saw contented quarry setting down its head to drink. The sign creaked in a wind no hedge admitted, and the fire inside had the colour that makes a room confess to comfort. I have hammered enough iron to know when heat persuades a shape. Her heat persuaded. What followed I did not witness with my eyes. I knew it with that other instrument a father is condemned and blessed to carry. The boy and the star came in under the roof of hospitality sharpened to a point. The bed made promises it could not honour without treachery. A pot bubbled diligence. The woman's ladle dispensed generosity in portions that measured the exact distance between kindness and murder. Yvain sat because Pain asked for chairs. Tristan accepted tea because decency does not like to insult courtesy. The unicorn came as far as the threshold, and then stood like a law that remembers justice. It disliked the air. It disliked the mirror, which fogged on the inside. It disliked a knife that had learned to wait. If you have ever taken one step into a room and then out again without quite knowing why, you have felt a unicorn thinking for you. Knots can be teachers. So can accidents. Tristan fumbled at his pocket. The fragment of Babylon candle he had saved, part prudence, part sentiment, made its own small argument for action. Desire is a treacherous compass, but danger clarifies it. In the instant when the eldest witch leaned her politeness toward completion, the boy did the arithmetic of survival and love, and came up with a sum that required flame. Space acknowledged the debt. For the length it takes a heart to remember its name, two travellers stood nowhere a map insists on, then somewhere the world had not prepared an inn for, and then, mercifully, not under that roof. Mercy does not travel alone either. It arrives with price and with mess. The unicorn did what law does when paper fails. It made itself plain. Horn struck glamour. Hooves revised argument. But the world, even when kindly disposed, does not make clean rescues as often as songs suggest. In the struggle that ensued, the kind where chairs forget manners and crockery proves its fragility, the creature of winter grace took a wound meant for brightness. It stood long enough to be formal about dying, which is to say long enough to make sure the living had begun to understand their task. If you think I tell this part quickly, it is because some griefs must be walked around like ponds. One stares a moment, nods to the reflection, and passes on. On our side of the stone, the bell above my door rang 3 times in a pattern I would have sworn belonged to a day when the roof leaked and we caught water in pans. I mended a rake that had lost its mind for a farmer who had lost his temper, then apologized to both. I oversalted a stew and pretended I meant to, the way men do when the recipe is not to blame. The cat discovered an unambitious moth and made it into a sermon on moderation. These are the small comic rites that keep a house from cracking, while the larger theatre next door rehearses tragedy. Tristan and Yvain went on from that place with fewer illusions and more ease in their silence. He had begun to understand that protecting someone is not the same as possessing them, and that promises worth keeping rarely travel on chains. She had begun to suspect that falling is not always a matter of losing one's height, but sometimes of learning the weight of being kept alive by another's attention. On nights when she could not help but glow, the countryside practiced acceptance. On mornings when he stumbled, she spoke one word and made it into a plank he could step onto. There is a country only 2 people can see. They had crossed into it, unlicensed but not unwelcome. The prince's roads, meanwhile, intersected with the witch's patience, as iron filings find their star and arrange themselves into a picture of fate. The bath Primus favoured steamed with a comfort that proved fatal, for the eldest sister had a talent for making warmth into weapon. When his attendants found the water, it was merely water again, and the dead brothers nodded without surprise. Septimus, counting and counting, felt the topaz pull like tide, and set his face toward a conclusion. He would be the kind of king a winter approves, if the gem and the story consented. The gem, like any honest judge, required the presence of all parties. News at wall arrived as it does when a tale begins, to approach its hinge. A woman I trust told me she had seen a carriage travel at the speed of a decision. A boy swore the stars had argued after dusk, and then agreed, their light settling into one unruffled thought. The watchman at the gap heard a bell that did not belong to our church. I scrubbed the counter until it returned a version of my face I could stand, then walked to the wall and put my palm on the stones as if they were an old animal I had once fed by hand. There is a point at which a father's hoping turns into a craft. You set aside the extravagance that makes prayers loud and keep only the part that makes them accurate. I wrote in the undeliverable letter 3 instructions and a wish. When you must leave a place that will not let you leave, make a door. Then thank the wall. When a good creature falls for your sake, do not let your sorrow make of its gift a statue. And when you light the smallest candle you possess, be certain your desire names a person and not a glory. The wish I folded blank. A blank wish can sometimes be persuaded to become the exact one needed. The road, corrected now by grief, took them to quiet corners. A farm kitchen that believed their hunger without asking for lineage. A hedgerow that parted for a minute because it liked the sound of their talk. A rill that made the same music. Water always makes when it discovers it can go on. Yvain learned to sit where her side hurt least. Tristan learned to make a fire with a courtesy that asked the wood's permission. In such low miracles, two travellers become companions. The chain became a keepsake without duties. If all this sounds gentler than the world is, remember that gentleness is often a sign of work well done. The eldest witch had not abandoned her arithmetic. She had merely sharpened her pencil. Septimus had not spent his patience. He had merely invested it at interest. The dead brothers had not grown bored. They had improved their vantage. And the topaz, which had been a stone, now behaved like a sentence, missing only its subject. It waited. But we still wonder whether escape teaches us the right lesson or simply teaches us to run better, and whether the truest safety is the kind that makes us brave rather than cautious. In Wall, I overbaked a loaf and ate the dark crust with pleasure, a reminder that errors, if timed, crisp into something you can enjoy. My wife set a sprig of rosemary in a bottle because the bottle had earned a second purpose. The cat, abandoning theology, slept with shameless peace on the account books. I took out the candle stub I had not given my son and put it away again, not speaking the wish that rose in me. Somewhere, a boy who was more than my boy, and a star who was more than her falling, kept a pace that belonged to them, and the world, both worlds, stilted slightly to let them pass. Autumn edged nearer, and with it that clarity of air which makes even the ordinary look confessed. I set out nails in the morning and found they lined themselves as if reporting for duty. The bell over my door rang with a sobriety that would have suited a church. Our neighbour's roses attempted one last gallant bloom. I told myself that weather is only weather, and not an omen, and the part of me that lies politely to the rest nodded agreement. The other part, the one that has stood too often at the gap, listening, kept its counsel. By then, the tale had narrowed its lanes. Of the princes of Stormhold, only Septimus remained in calculation and Primus in memory. The bathhouse tiles that had remembered comfort remembered murder instead. The water had cooled. The dead brothers, faithful ushers of consequence, took another step back to make room for the endgame. The topaz that once hung from the old lord's throat and had been flung starward the night a true star fell, now gave off a temper of decision. Stones are patient until they are not. The gem had begun to behave less like a jewel and more like a law. Tristan and Yvain walked toward a crossroads where hospitality had learned its manners from hunger. This was not the cake-soft house that had first tried to make of rest a crime. It was leaner, lower, shrewder, with shutters that glanced every traveller up and down, as if adding them to an account. A sign swung in no wind at all. Inside, the fire acted like a clerk who understands what must be done and wishes it were else. The eldest of the three grey women had arranged her courtesy more tightly. The years she had stolen from the world with the brief knife of other hearts had sharpened her to a point. The road, which has a genius for irony, brought Septimus there as well, the last living son of Stormhold, a winter taught to wear boots. He came with a look men put on when they mean to conclude a story to their advantage, and do not expect the punctuation to argue. I did not see the first minutes. I felt them, the way a man feels the weather change through the hinge of his own door. A room where two ends of a tale have agreed to meet grows a pressure that even crockery understands. The witch lady laid out comfort like lures. The prince laid out calculation like cards. And my boy, who had learned knotted rope and honest fear, and the difference between a chain that orders and a hand that steadies, put his body between the fallen star and everyone else, without pausing to make a speech. Yvain, whose light had been practicing modesty, allowed it a little more license. Even in daylight, even in rooms, the truth slips through. The topaz did its work then, as all true tokens must when the weight of meanings compels them. It was not a flare so much as a remembering. Stones keep company with crowns and with earth. They know lineage in their sleep. It leaned, that jewel, as a hawk leans to air it trusts. When the prince lifted it, the light travelled toward the boy rather than toward the winter-hearted man who expected obedience. Septimus frowned in the decent astonishment of someone who has done his arithmetic and finds that numbers can, under duress, change their taste. He turned his astonishment quickly into action, for he was not a slow man. A knife asked for a path. A glamour put on another face. The hearth learned about draughts. And then all at once, as if both worlds had been waiting to exhale, the room became an argument with no grammar. It is in the nature of true peril that it rarely begins with a shout. A spilled cup can drown a kingdom. The witch's kindness shed its costume and kept the teeth. Septimus moved like a verdict. The dead brothers watched, polite as pillars. Tristan broke the line of custom that had kept him decent and allowed him for the first time to be brave without asking permission. The silver chain between him and Yvain, which had already forgotten how to command, gave up its last pretense. He let it fall and did not look down to see where it went. I have handled chains in the shop. The honest ones hold, the bad ones break late. This one did not break. It became irrelevant. There are moments when a boy discovers that the body remembers lessons faster than the mind does. Tristan moved as a sailor does when the deck objects hand to rail. Eyes for corners, breath saved for the task. He deflected a gesture that would have turned Yvain's light inward. He turned a chair into a barrier and a sweeping of embers into a verdict. The witch met him with the etiquette of malice. Glamours blurred her age, courtesy sharpened her aim. If you have ever watched a cat walk the edge of a shelf and pretend nothing could possibly fall, you know the flavour of it. Septimus, to his credit, did not wait for the room to recognize him as its axis. He brought a handful of signs to bear, old letters that the air still reads because men like him have insisted for centuries that it must. The witch frowned at the inconvenience of another professional present. In the brief collaborations of predators, etiquette is very important and very brief. He cast, she countered. She smiled, he suffered. The dead brothers nodded in their gallery as if to say yes. That is the proper order of things, until quite suddenly it was no longer the order at all. For the star's light no longer starry only, but seasoned by hunger and kindness, and nights spent learning how to be seen without being owned touched the edge of the quarrel. It did not blaze. It insisted. Things that feed on hearts dislike insistence from the thing they would have eaten. The room altered its opinion. A mirror remembered river. A kettle remembered storm. The topaz, chastened and precise, remembered blood and the law of Stormhold, which says a throne is not taken by the hand that grasps, but by the light that answers. It answered the boy. Septimus saw it and made the only honest calculation left to him. If he could not have the throne by the gem's choosing, he might have it by removing the piece the gem seemed to love. He turned his hand toward Tristan. The witch, who had intended to end the matter with a cut that would unspool years back into her body, made the same decision at the same time for a different hunger. Their malices crossed like blades. Still, even craft runs out against a simple objection. Yvain's light silvers what it touches. The witch reached, and the reaching burned. Septimus lunged, and the lunge met a table leg that had been waiting all its life to serve justice. A pot burst its patience into steam. The eldest sister learned in that precise minute that there are thresholds beyond which even a careful woman cannot rephrase the world into obedience. She retreated with the keen economy of a professional missed by an inch. Septimus did not retreat. Winter does not like to move backward. He fell the way a rule falls when a story has outgrown it. The dead brothers, to their credit, bowed. On our side, the bell above my door gave a single thin ring, and then kept still. The way a child does when it decides to listen. I sharpened a blade until the whetstone sang, and thought how a small, exact edge accomplishes what a broad, dull one ruins. My wife said that the bean plants had given a last handful, the kind of harvest gardens make to be polite. I spilled a few on the table and counted them into the hush, as if they were the last beads on a string a person wears to their first crown. The cat knocked one to the floor, batted it under the dresser, and looked at me as if to say that even coronations need a joke. The tail on the far side did what tails do when they escape a room that had been meant to contain them. It widened. Yvain stood and did not lean. Tristan stood and did, but only for a breath, and then remembered what a spine is for. The topaz behaved now as if it had always been honest. In its light, something else turned toward him the memory of a name he had not yet been told. There was a woman in that house who had been a presence in his life as a note held at the far end of a melody. Her hand, quicker than fear, undid a small thing that had been done years ago in the interest of keeping a kingdom's games tidy. A knot loosened, a spell conceded. Una, daughter of Stormhold, did not wear her chain any more, and all the names in the room had to rearrange themselves. The world respects certain recognitions. Mother and son is one of them. It shows its respect by not announcing itself like a town crier. A look, a breath, a tiny foolish thing, like a letter in a pocket that has finally come home. Those are the trumpets. Tristan learned the truth of himself not by someone telling him who he was, but by the world. For a moment, agreeing not to lie. He did not fall to his knees. He did not make speeches. He adjusted how he stood. If you have ever been promoted by surprise to carrying something you already loved, you know the sensation. The weight is right, and your hands were already rehearsed. Una, being herself, set aside joy the way a woman sets aside a shawl to be claimed later. She did the practical thing, to see that the witch had retreated rather than hidden, that Septimus's story had indeed ended, that the dead brothers had no further business, and that the boy and the star could leave a door that had the manners of a trap. There are hours when love is logistics. They quit the house with the neatness of workers finishing a long job at dusk. Outside, the hedges exhaled. The road remembered it was only a road. Back in Wall, the watchman told me the wind had shifted, as if a door had been opened someplace a sensible map would deny. They did not ask me what I heard in it. Men who keep a gap understand the holiness of not asking. I went home by the longer path to give the universe a little more time to compose its face. My wife had laid out 2 plates and then found a third, and put it away and then set it out again. I kissed her cheek the way a man does when he knows his next words will change the balance of history in a room with a cat and a kettle. Then I said nothing, for now was not the time for the shape of the truth, only for its possibility, and we ate in the civilized quiet that keeps kingdoms from becoming spectacles. But we still wonder whether the light that chooses us makes us worthy, or whether it is our willingness to be chosen that finally teaches the light how to shine in human rooms. After supper I wrote one line in the letter no post will carry, and for the first time signed my name beneath it in a hand that did not apologize. When the door is a crown, enter as a servant. Then I blew out the lamp, listened to the house review its timbers, and felt the night lay a hand on my shoulder, the way a father does when his son comes through a door older than when he left. There are names a man carries like tools, and others like weather. Dunstan Thorn has been enough for most duties required of a husband, shopkeeper, neighbour, at whose threshold mislaid hammers reliably turn up. But that week the air itself behaved as if a longer name had been spoken in a far room, and all the doors in our village were listening to learn how to pronounce it. I set out nails, straightened them to attention, and discovered my hands were performing a ceremony I had not planned. The bell over the door rang its sensible note. A good note. The sort that keeps panic standing politely in the lane. Across the wall, where hedges lean in to keep confidences and roads do their sly arithmetic, a small set of truths finished clearing its throat. Onohu had sat years ago under a scarlet awning with a chain-speaking fluent patience, was no longer anyone's captive. In the house where comfort had lately tried to pass for murder, she had unmade what needed unmaking. Septimus, trained by winter to expect deference from air and stone, had discovered that a topaz disagrees less noisily than a court, but more finally. The dead brothers removed their hats as if a verdict had been read. Yvain stood unleaning and lit the corners like the part of dawn that keeps its manners indoors. And Tristan, my boy, stood in the presence of his unguessed name as if he had always been rehearsing the posture. Una looked at him, and the room rearranged itself around the fact. No speeches. The truth was a quiet thing, handled by hands that understood logistics. It was decided by a glance, by a soft yes, by a prince who had been cancelled by a stone, and a witch who had retreated with the economy of a professional that they would leave the trap house neat, like workmen finishing at dusk. Outside, the hedges returned to their preferred business of separating sheep from ideas. The road resumed its humility and offered to lead rather than decide. What does a father do on the day his son is recognized by a jewel and a kingdom he does not yet claim? He sells lamp oil. He advises a widow that a patched pail tells the truth longer than a new one tells lies. He shows a small boy the trick of polishing a coin with a crust of bread, until both seem improved. He eats his noon slice of cheese and finds it sufficient. And under those acts he listens for the way silence changes when a name is carried properly by the person to whom it belongs. Silence did change. It grew roomy, like a church that has just had scaffolding taken down. Rumour, being a conscientious employee of destiny, brought me details on a sober tray. A drover reported that a woman with Una's eyes had given orders to the air and been obeyed. A peddler claimed the topaz showed clear preference for a young man who did not look like a prince until he stood still, and then he looked like the ending of an argument. The watchers at the gap swore they heard the walls on the far side practice pronouncing Stormhold, as if they were deciding where to put the stress. I thanked each messenger with coin or tea or a nod, according to his appetite, and then I went to the wall and placed my palm on the stone the way one touches an old horse, to remind it of who fed it oats when the barn was lean. Beyond, the story adjusted its stride. Una did not waste a minute of her liberty. She put herself between her son and every leftover tangle from a long, cruel patience. Words were said to the air that taught distances to behave. Yvain, having learned the human art of saving light for when it matters, walked without showing off and showed everything that counted. Tristan, who had once tried to own a star to earn a village girl's evening, walked now as if a star were a person, and an evening were a place two people could build between them. The silver chain, promoted to keepsake, lay in his pack with the humility of retired tools. They did not march on Stormhold like a drum. The road asked for smaller ceremonies first. A crofter's kitchen recognized hunger. With that particular welcome the poor know best. A hedge parted in the way plants sometimes do when they mean to be polite to royalty before the crown has been fetched. A sly stream reminded everyone that even kingdoms must drink. In such pauses, a mother and a son learn the grammar of late introductions. Some of it is talk. Some of it is the quiet that forgives you for not having known sooner. Meanwhile, the world balanced its ledgers. The three grey women counted again and found subtraction had grown arrogant. The eldest, politest, sharpest considered her mirrors until they began to remember rivers too quickly. She tightened her glamours like a bodice and swore an end to dithering. This I learned from the way the wind pushed our lane from the wrong direction, and then apologized. And from the vicar's niece, who said the moon had blinked. When a child reports that the moon has blinked and you believe her, you are in the neighbourhood of truth. The dead brothers, still attentive, took up new vantage by the crossroads only the dead keep well. They were not unkind. Men who have laid down knives learn excellent manners. They watched for an heir who would not fumble the topaz when it finally stopped leaning and simply pointed. Una, who had once counted her hours by links upon a chain, measured them now by decisions and by glances exchanged over maps that knew better than to pretend distances are impartial. Stormhold's ministers, sensing weather, began to practice the faces they would use when asked to welcome an heir born of two worlds. Ministers are quick studies in weather. Back in Wall, the lighter work of survival insisted upon itself. I dropped a spoon and blamed it for being round. The cat, entering into the spirit of diplomacy, batted the spoon under a chair and then escorted it out again, as if concluding a treaty. My wife baked a barley loaf so cheerful that the knife always. The sceptic in such matters hesitated out of respect. I wrote a line in the letter no post will carry. A true name does not replace an old one. It completes its sentence. I added a second. When a crown chooses you, wear it where your hands can still lift a kettle. From what I could piece together by that arithmetic, fathers use equal parts, rumour, breath, and eke plan, took this shape. Tristan would bring Yvain to Wall, not to deliver a prize, as once he had puffed his chest to promise, but to finish a sentence honestly begun and badly phrased, to tell Victoria Forrester that the dare which sent a boy over the wall had made, instead, a man who owed no one proof of his worth, except the woman he loved and the kingdom that would be entrusted to his mercy. Una would go with them as far as the threshold allowed, for the old laws still favour thresholds. A wall is a creature. It has feelings about who steps through. After, Tristan would return by right of stone and blood to Stormhold, not as a boy promoted by accident, but as a man insisted upon by a duel, and by a mother whose eyes had outlasted captivity. I can hear you asking whether our side's stern doorkeepers agreed to any such procession. They did, as men do when they understand that upholding a rule and fulfilling its purpose can, on excellent days, be the same act. The Gap has seen smugglers and lovers and fools. It has seen saints who did not know they were saints until the moment after. It could accommodate one more exception that validated the law rather than insulted it. The watchers told me this, with the careful complacence of men who have finally been permitted to be generous without breaking their oath. A skyship Captain Burley Rumour, dressed as a man, appeared long enough to tip his hat toward a boy who had left his deck stronger than he came. I learned this detail from a shepherd who knows hats. A unicorn was not there. Winter had already been asked to keep that gift. But in the hedges, a pale hare caught days ago returned to mind with the courtesy of gratitude. Yvain, whose light had learned discretion, walked beside Tristan through dusk, as if dusk were proud to have her. Those who saw them pretended afterward that they had seen only two travellers, and the road remembering where it led. But we still wonder whether a person can carry two homes without one cracking, and whether a true name, once learned, can live peaceably beside all the smaller names that taught us how to answer. The evening before the day the world meant to change its handwriting, I closed the shop early. I set the bell gently against the door, as if it were a child being put to bed. My wife and I moved through the kitchen with the choreography of long practice. She set 3 bowls out, and then, with a small smile at herself, set a 4th. The cat performed a ceremonial patrol of the windowsill, found nothing amiss on the horizon of turnips, and lay down as if to bless the future by napping on it. I took from a drawer the candle stub I had not given my son, and held it in the palm of my hand until my skin warmed the tallow. Then I put it back. A man must not overspend miracles when decency will do. In the quiet that follows honest work, I stood by our window and watched the lane invent starlight out of very little. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a mother and a son walked within speaking distance of a wall that had once divided a boy from his own story, and was now preparing grudgingly and with pride to welcome him to the next chapter. A fallen star walked at their side, less fallen now than placed. The way you place a lamp on a table and find that the room becomes true around it. Stormhold waited, Wall waited. Between them stood an opening older than my village and younger than my hope. Morning came honest and undecorated, the way a doorway looks when you have decided at last to step through it. I opened the shop out of habit more than need, set the bell to its small duty, and tidied a counter that had already confessed its orderliness. Then I locked up again, for habit must bow when history clears its throat. My wife took my arm without comment. We walked the lane that knows our steps, past roses having second thoughts, past a cat that pretended not to recognize us in order to retain dignity, and came to the gap in the wall where two men with staves have kept company with the word no for longer than I have kept company with my own name. They were dressed as they always are dressed, in the authority of custom and the embarrassment of being asked to make exceptions. One cleared his throat, the other examined a stone as if it were new to him. I nodded the way a man does to old rules on a day when they are about to become their best selves. The meadow beyond wore that not-quite look again, the green that suggests a field and discusses other matters with the air when it thinks no one is watching. We waited as one waits for bread to finish its thought in the oven, and we did not speak. First came Una, moving with the calm of a woman who has practiced an entrance longer than anyone knew. She wore no chain. If you have ever seen a door be relieved of its lock and yet continue to stand upright, you know the dignity she carried. The watchers straightened as doors do when a hinge has just been oiled. Then, in the measured space that allows one truth to sit down before introducing another, came Tristan and Yvain. He walked as if his height had finally remembered him. She walked as if light were a courtesy she kept in her pocket for moments when a room or a lane required truth. The morning did its best to be only morning. It failed and became an occasion. Rules, if they are good rules, have within them the capacity to recognize their own purpose when it arrives wearing new clothes. The elder watcher tapped his stave once on the stone, not so much a denial as a remembrance of duty, and then stood aside. The gap seemed wider than I had ever seen it. Una put her hand to the boundary the way a queen might touch the shoulder of a loyal servant, and stopped, for there are laws about who may go where, and no woman with her history intends to be a poor guest of any law again. She looked at me, and we exchanged that ancestor of speeches in which people of age say yes to one another without dress rehearsals. Tristan and Yvain stepped through. Now I must tell you about Victoria Forrester, for she has been, like weather, present in this account even when not remarked upon. She came down the lane with the expectancy of someone used to being the interesting part of other people's afternoons. She was lovely, as a fine, well-warped ribbon is lovely. Years from now, when she will be teaching a child to fold linen, that loveliness will still be true. But loveliness is not the same as the rightness of two notes agreeing. She paused when she saw the company at the gap. She looked at Tristan the way a person looks at a former mirror, with a search for certainty and a suspicion that the glass has been moved. Tristan greeted her. There are words a man speaks when his heart has grown into its clothes. He used those. He did not mention stars as prizes or vows shouted at the sky. He said her name as if it were a neighbour's gate he had mended once and admired for its straightforward swing. He thanked her, which puzzled her, for who thanks the dare that sent him away from childhood? He apologized, tidy as a craftsman puts away a chisel for having tried to turn love into a proof. Then he did the thing. All the good lessons in fairy had been conspiring to teach him. He told the truth without the jewelry of promises. He loved Yvain. He would not ask Victoria to be impressed with that fact, only to be free of the burden he had once laid at her feet. Victoria stared a moment, and then something sensible in her, which had been waiting for its chance to be heard over her beauty, stepped forward. She laughed, softly, not unkindly, and shook her head at all the ninth-year markets of youth. She said there was someone else she had discovered she liked to be herself around, and shame, like fog, lifted from the lane. If you wish a blessing upon a village, wish that its proudest girl learns early the distinction between being wooed and being seen. She had learned it. Tristan bowed. Yvain, who had been ready to be brave if required, stood down from bravery with a relief that lit her quieter than any star could. I confess I did a small, foolish thing. I touched the chain in my pocket that I do not keep there, the ghost of it, and it did not burn me. Then I did a wise thing. I put my hand on my boy's shoulder and felt in that bone and cloth the answer to prayers I had not named out loud. If you have ever carried an infant whose weight is mostly the future, and then, years afterward, set your hand on that same life standing upright, you know why men go briefly and pointlessly blind. We walked home by the respectable route that would let neighbours see what they were entitled to see, and not have to pretend later that the world changes only in barns and hedgerows. The bell over my door rang and behaved, valiantly domestic to the last. My wife placed 4 bowls on the table, and then, after a glance at Una and at herself, placed a 5th, because tea is the most royal ceremony our house possesses. We fed history with barley and onions. Yvain learned where the spoons live. Una learned how our chair forgives a new sitter. The cat inspected everyone with clerical composure, then approved Yvain first and Una second, and Tristan always. Animals recognized the grammar of households. When the bowls were emptied and the kettle had argued itself hoarse, we spoke of the next steps. This is the cruelty and the mercy of joy. It has logistics. A kingdom does not invite itself, and a wall does not forget its job simply because it admires your reasons. Una must return to Stormhold by the routes that know her feet. Tristan must accompany her, not as a boy running away from wall to prove bottomless devotion to a village dare, but as a man answering a summons, written in topaz and in a mother's patience. Yvain must go where her heart will not be hunted, which is to say, wherever Tristan stands, for the laws that pursued her had spent themselves, and the sisters' arithmetic was nearly out of numbers. It was decided that we would all go as far as the gap, and there part according to law and longing. On the way, perhaps because the morning had begun in ceremony and had learned to enjoy it, people found reasons to be in their doorways. They greeted us as folk greet a story that has been told correctly at last. No hurrahs, that is not Wall's way, but nods and bread held out, and 2 children who bowed with a solemnity stolen from a visiting play. The vicar's wife dabbed an eye and blamed it on the wind. A man whose fence I had once mended doffed his cap, and gave it the turn reserved for funerals and weddings, which this was, in a manner of speaking. At the gap, the watchers stood already reshaped by what they had witnessed that morning. One of them said that a rule fulfills itself when the thing it has been guarding becomes the door it wished to be. He apologized for the philosophy. I told him it was decent philosophy and needed no pardon. Una took my wife's hand in hers, and 2 kingdoms met without fuss. Yvain stood a little closer to Tristan than propriety requires, and looked at the stones with the tolerant politeness of a guest who understands the house rules. There are partings that wound and partings that bless. This was the second kind, though it carried the ache the first kind claims as its monopoly. I embraced my son. If you have ever tried to fit years into an arm's circle, you know the comedy. I told him 3 small things, because large advice is an insult to moments like that. Keep your knife clean, pay out rope like trust, and take it back, without shaming the knot. Remember that a crown is only a hat until you stoop under a low doorway while wearing it. He nodded with that grave, courteous look the skyship had taught him. Yvain thanked us for hot soup as if we had offered her a new constellation. Una looked once more at the village where a past error had matured into a family, and then turned her face homeward. But we still wonder whether love that learns to speak plainly at last can remain plain when thrones are listening, and whether the modest rooms that teach us our names can go on living in us when halls acquire our echoes. They stepped away into the meadow that is not a meadow. The hedges leaned, pleased with themselves. The light took on that taste of brass and apple that autumn keeps in a pocket for days worth remembering. My wife's hand found mine. The watchers returned to their staves, blessed now because they had been used for welcome as well as warning. We went back to the shop. I set the bell again, because the bell's work is to tell the house the world has entered. It rang once, shyly, and then, settling, found the note by which our days would proceed until the next 9th-year market asked to borrow the village again. On the counter lay my undeliverable letter, folded twice and stained with a life's small sources. I added 1 final line, and did not sign it. When your child crosses a threshold, you cannot put bread by the door and light in the window, and keep the tools sharp for the day. He returns to mend the hinge you did not know was loose. The day after partings always arrives a touch too bright, like a room someone has tidied while you were out, placing everything exactly where it ought to live, and daring you to remember the old kindly clutter. I opened the shop and found the nails already standing to attention, as if they had chosen ranks in my absence. The bell over the door rang the modest note it keeps for hours that must be borne with decency. I set out twine, lamp oil, and a box of hinges that believe in patience, and then I stood for a while with my hand on the counter, feeling for the new pulse that begins in a house the moment a son carries his story across a horizon and the father's work becomes listening. Beyond the wall, the road behaved as it will when it recognizes a procession worth remembering. Hedges inclined their green heads. Stones held still to be counted. The topaz of Stormhold, which had already chosen its direction in private, began to behave publicly like law rather than jewelry. Una walked first, not from pride, but because a kingdom respects a woman who has outlasted chains and still keeps courtesy in her voice. Tristan kept pace with her, long stride levelled by something steadier than eagerness. Yvain came beside him with that composed light which is less about shining than about about telling the truth to every corner around her. If the dead brothers walked also, they did so as witnesses learning deep satisfaction. In wall, I mended a rake for a man who apologizes to his tools. I weighed seed for a gardener who talks to beans as if they were nephews who need encouraging. My wife scolded the cat for disrespecting the butter and then forgave it because forgiveness suits a kitchen. These softer sentences are not an evasion. They are the rope you hold when the river runs faster than you can swim. Each errand steadied the part of me that wanted to stand at the gap all day like a nail waiting to be hammered into purpose. Rumour did the rest. It came dry-shod across ditches that would drown facts. A drover said the gates of Stormhold opened not as iron opens, but as a book does when the hand that wrote it returns. A merchant swore that banners stirred before any wind arrived, as if colour itself had recognized its king. The ministers, that diligent weather, arranged their faces into welcome, and the topaz, lifted before a court that knows exactly how far it is from power to pageantry, leaned in Tristan's direction with final serene insistence. It did not flare, it pointed. Even a jewel knows the difference between spectacle and answer. You ask what a father hears in such news. He hears his own breath decide to go about its business without arguing. He hears the bell over his door strike true. He hears, somewhere behind the ribs, a door that has been ajar for years swing the rest of the way open and stay. I wiped the counter the way a craftsman does when he is polishing something larger than wood. The village came and went, supplying me with dignified reasons to remain useful while history sorted itself across the hedge. A widow wanted a latch that would close softly enough to let grandchildren keep believing in dreams. A boy brought an old pocket-knife and asked whether a blade can remember its first sharpness. I told him yes, if the hand that holds it remembers to be kind. The ceremony, which I did not see, went as such things should when a story has earned its cadence. Una was named not as a rumour who had interrupted the arithmetic of kings, but as the sum that makes the column add. She stood beside her son, where a mother stands, not before, not behind, but in the margin where corrections live, red and merciful. The dead brothers bowed and were gone, their work finished. The hall's long banners learned a calmer way to hang. If there were courtiers who had trained their smiles to face another direction, they untaught themselves quickly. For a court survives by remembering that truth is more durable than fashion. Tristan accepted what the stone named him. He did not kneel. He adjusted his shoulders as a man will when a cloak finds the right wearer and ceases to feel like theatre. Of the 3 grey sisters, subtraction had carried 2 to the thin place where hunger grows abstract and then sleeps. The eldest, narrowed to purpose, considered the light that stood beside a human boy and discovered that appetite cannot cross a threshold. Truth keeps in a small iron key. She receded, not vanquished with trumpets, but dismissed by the ordinary. Doors shut, hearths banked, laughter that had nothing to do with bargains. In old tales, evil is dismissed with noise. In life, it is often escorted to the edge of the map by chores. Floors get swept, kettles boil, kingdoms put on their workday faces, and the danger still real, only suddenly smaller finds itself with nowhere to sit. Back at the shop, I made the kind of mistakes a contented man makes. I salted the stew twice and then ate it with pleasure because it told the truth about my attention. I wrapped a parcel in paper more carefully than paper requires. I counted nails into a box and found I was humming the tune the skyship men had beaten into the boards when they teased lightning down. My wife set an extra cup on the shelf without noticing, which is the house's way of practicing for guests the future will send. The cat took a nap on the account book, as if blessing commerce with indolence. Word came by the old road at dusk. There had been no crown set down that day, because crowns are patient, and prefer to wait until a kingdom's breathing matches the new rhythm. There had been, instead, the formal naming, which is a crown's rehearsal and often more honest. Tristan had spoken in that clear, workman's way I recognize as my own mixed with a music I cannot claim. He thanked the realm for holding itself together while men argued. He named his mother before he named himself. He looked toward the place where Yvain stood, and did not glance away to consult faces trained in approval. That was when, said the drover, the hall itself agreed to serve. After the naming, there was the human work of doors and corridors. I have never walked those halls, but I could imagine the grain of the wood underhand, the hush that follows formal words, the laughter of servants rediscovering ordinary tempo. I could imagine Una's palm resting briefly against a stone pillar, as if greeting an old animal. I could imagine Yvain walking with a new ease, for peril had stopped demanding rent, and Tristan, who had once set out to fetch a star as if it were proof of a boy's seriousness, now consulting maps that deal with taxes and bridges and winter stores, eyes steadied by the presence of someone who sees across both worlds without blinking. Meanwhile, the ministers learned to say wall without making it sound like a provincial curiosity. Messengers began to practice the long path between our market green and their court, and the Gap's watchers rehearsed hospitality that does not abandon caution. A rule had grown its best leaf, the one that shades the way rather than blocks it. They told me this themselves, those men with staves, standing straighter not because they had bent, but because their duty had discovered its mercy. I thank them with tea and silence, for in wall we consider that kind of conversation eloquent. I wrote in my undeliverable letter 3 plain lines for a son who no longer needs letters to hear his father. Replace nothing you can repair. Repair nothing you can forgive. And when you must choose between being right and being kind, remember that a kingdom can survive many wrongs corrected by kindness, but very few rights enforced without it. There were, of course, jokes. A child asked whether a star must pay tax on her light. The vicar's wife said yes in hymns. A farmer declared he would breed a line of cabbages worthy of royal stew, and then, finding himself overheard by no one important, decided to do it anyway. A mason offered to set a commemorative stone by the lane, and then remembered that the lane's memory is already better than granite. These small laughters loosened the air the way a window does when a house has been full of company. Toward evening, a shepherd who cares more for the truth than for embroidery said simply this: he had seen a light over the eastern hills that moved like a thought, slow, certain, unwilling to dazzle. He believed it to be Yvain walking a balcony and trying not to wake the stars to jealousy. I took the statement down as a receipt and put it in the ledger of things that change a man's sleep. But we still wonder whether a crown, even when deserved, can rest lightly on a head that remembers the weight of a father's hand, and whether the light we love can go on telling the truth in halls that have practised listening to flatteries. The shop closed at its proper hour. I set the bell carefully, the way you lay a child to bed when you expect company in the morning. My wife and I stood a little while at the window. The lane arranged what starlight it possessed. The cat, with ceremonial indifference, approved the evening. I put away the candle stub I had not lit, and was glad I had not needed to. In a kingdom of stone, and in a village of hedges, doors had remembered their duties. Names had found their sentences, and a father, who has learned by now that the heart is a hinge, felt it swing with a sound both old and entirely new. Some choices arrive like storms, others come on soft feet, tidy as servants, setting teacups where the saucers have been waiting. In the days after the naming, the village resumed its careful hum, and still the air kept an extra polish, as if it expected guests. I opened the shop, set out hinges with their patient faces, poured oil by the inch, as though that could steady time, and discovered that my thoughts had learned a new route. From wall to stormhold, and back again, by way of a balcony where, they said, a quiet light walked in the evenings and made the stone confess its colour. Letters began to travel between our side and theirs. Not by post, for the Gap respects old habits, but by couriers who looked like shepherds when they were not, and like ministers when they preferred to be asked fewer questions. The watchers handled seals without peeking, which is a high art. My wife baked the kind of cake that persuades men to sit while news is read aloud, and neighbours found reasons to pass our door at the hour when couriers most often appeared. We became, briefly, a little court of our own. 2 cups, 1 letter, and the consent of a cat who approved any ceremony that kept laps still. One afternoon, as the lane practised autumn, a messenger in a plain cloak asked for me by name, and then, politely, asked whether I would walk away with him. We went to the Gap where the stone wears the gloss of generations of palms. There, as simply as a man might hand another a tool. He gave me a parchment with my name in a hand I recognized from a note once tucked into a wicker basket. Una's script made even the errands of a kingdom look like invitations to tea. The letter was brief. It said that Stormhold wished to prove itself the sort of place that could keep 2 worlds in its guest room without breaking the furniture. It asked, therefore, whether Dunstan Thorn might come and see for himself and give the opinion of a man who knows the weight of nails and the price of roofs. My wife packed a small bag with the unconquerable cheer of a woman who trusts me to return. The cat supervised. The watchers looked as if they had been practising a speech and decided in the end to rely on the eloquence of standing aside. The meadow beyond had its not-quite-greenness on, and distance did its courteous trick of shortening itself for a guest who did not pretend to deserve it. I will not play the guidebook. What I saw is not improved by my adjectives. I will say only that Stormhold wore its age the way a good oak wears rings nothing to prove, and everything quietly accounted for. The banners had stopped trying to impress their own hall. The stones were clean, but not so clean that history had been scrubbed off. Una met me where a mother and a queen can be both without apology, at a side door where servants come and go, because true ruling has more to do with traffic than with thrones. She put her hands on my shoulders and laughed at the length of the road between us, which was suddenly the length of a hug. She took me along corridors that did not echo rudely, and into a room whose windows admitted the world with discernment. There I found Tristan, taller than my memory could accommodate, and Yvain, whose presence made the light in that room stop being a technician and become a witness. We spoke of small things first, because small things are the joints that let larger truths move. I told them that Mrs. Quill had had the good sense to remarry, and that her new husband, Mr. Monday, had the look of a man who can be relied on to carry pies level and feelings kindly. They told me a shepherd had discovered that the eastern pastures preferred to be grazed on a 9-day rotation rather than 8, which had the ring of revelation disguised as husbandry. We laughed in the sober way people do when they are testing a bridge between old rooms and new ones. Then we arrived at the part where history asked for pen and ink. Una intended this, she said, with the neat authority of someone who has waited for years and now refuses to waste minutes to reign long enough to ensure that girders had been checked and roofs would hold under winter. After that, she would yield the actual weight of Stormhold to Tristan. He, for his part, did not intend to be crowned while his learning still smelled of new tools. He wished to return to Wall first, not for proofs, but for farewells and for the moral arithmetic that care requires, to settle accounts with days that had raised him, to make promises he could keep from both sides of the hedge, and to ask the village to lend him to a kingdom without needing to borrow him back in regret. Yvain, whose voice is a lamp when it needs to be, added a sentence that made both worlds sit up straighter. She said she would walk where Tristan walked, not as a treasure in a pocket, not as a proof tucked under an arm, but as a person who had decided that her light could make a home of any place that did not ask her to shrink. In the old stories, that line would be given to a prince. It suited her better. The room warmed, not with fire, but with the feeling of furniture recognizing its masters. I was asked for counsel. It is a strange promotion, and a pleasant one, when the workman's opinion is not only tolerated but sought. I said the only true thing I knew, that a crown is a hat until it shelters someone other than the head that wears it, and that a village's blessing is worth more than any minister's flourish. Bring Wall your straightforwardness, I told them. Let the watchers keep their dignity. Ask nothing of the lane that would make it a road too proud to be walked by children. And remember, when the hall grows loud, that rooms are best ruled from the corner where the kettle is in sight. So they came by courtesy and by law back to the gap. Not at once. Kingdoms dislike suddenness unless they are staging legends. But soon enough, that the bread in our tin was still fresh and the cat still ready to be consulted. The watchers performed their old office in its improved key. They tested the rule by letting it fulfill itself. The village assembled without assembling, the way we do. Doors happened to be open, stools happened to be pulled near thresholds. Children had chalk ready for games that could be abandoned at any noble excuse. Tristan stood in the lane and looked at Wall the way a craftsman inspects a tool he loves. He thanked the place for raising him without knowing what it was raising. He thanked the women who had insisted he have clean shirts, and the men who had insisted he learn knots, and the wind for practicing mercy when it could. He did not make a speech about destiny. He asked permission to go. There was a pause, not hesitation, but the kind of pause a table makes before it accepts another plate. Then the village, being itself, said yes, in nods, in loaves, in stout jokes that protected tears from embarrassment. We walked him as far as the gap. Victoria Forrester, happiest in her proper story, came also, with Mr. Monday at her side, a good hand resting on a sincere sleeve. She kissed Tristan's cheek in the sisterly manner that is only learned by women who have been carefully seen. She pressed Yvain's hand with a respect that required no explanation. I shook Mr. Monday's hand and decided he would keep pies level for decades. Then my wife and I did what parents do when the world asks them to believe in the road. We stood back and we blessed without words. Tristan turned to me. There are things a father hopes to say at such a moment. None of them found an honest path to my mouth. So I touched his shoulder, where the crown would one day sit from the inside, and told him 3 useful, unimportant things: that the east hedge needed trimming, that the kettle squeaked when overfilled, that the cat could not be reasoned with on Thursdays. He understood, which is to say, he smiled without moving his face much, and nodded to matters that would keep us both real while grandeur did its best. They stepped through. The meadow held its breath, and then exhaled them toward roofs that had been waiting. Una followed by other ways, as queens do when they are teaching a law to remember its point. The watchers resumed their post, improved men without new uniforms. The village found reasons to carry on, butter to be coaxed, bread to be praised, fences to be persuaded into decency. I went back to the shop and set the bell exactly so. It rang with a note that could belong to any age that remembers what doors are for. But we still wonder whether leaving well is the secret art that makes returning true, and whether a love carried across a threshold can keep both rooms warm without stealing heat from either. That evening my wife and I lit 1 extra candle and put it in the window, not as a signal no one needed signals now, but as a habit confessed to the night. The cat approved the flame with aristocratic restraint. I took out my old undeliverable letter, read the lines that had taught an anxious man to pretend calm, and then folded it for the last time. The hinge of the heart, this I knew in my bones, had swung from fear into trust. Somewhere, a young man who had been my boy learned the first sentences of stewardship. Somewhere, a star who had learned to walk at a human pace leaned her light into maps, turning borders honest. And here, in the house that had practiced patience, the kettle began to sing as if someone had just come in from the lane and would be grateful for tea. The 9th year market arrived again as it always does, walking out of distance as if distance were an old friend with a new coat. The watchers oiled their staves. The hedges rehearsed their secrets. Bread was cut more generously. Gossip put on its best shoes. In Wall, time does not hurry and does not drowse. It keeps a craftsman's tempo. I set the bell to its task and opened the shop as if a kingdom had not learned my lane by heart. Nails stood like good soldiers. The cat, older and convinced of theology again, approved each customer with a blink that meant pay your bill and leave the butter alone. My wife kneaded dough with the air of someone who knows a season's true weather is made indoor. News from Stormhold no longer arrived like miracles, but like minutes. Couriers crossed the gap with the courtesy of men who know their boots carry two worlds. They brought ledgers and questions as often as they brought stories. Bridges to be repaired in the north, a steward to be corrected with kindness, a granary that wanted a better lock and a gentler winter. Somewhere in those practicalities walked Tristan, who had once been my boy and was now a man measured by the way rooms breathed easier when he entered. Beside him walked Yvain, whose light had learned the art of governance, steady enough to warm, exact enough to warn, never so bright it scolded. Una saw to the deep beams and the stubborn corners, reigning in the way good roofs do, without drama, without leaks. When letters came, they were full of small victories. A river persuaded back into its bed without humiliating it. A treaty signed after both sides had been served soup first. A festival restored in a village that had nearly agreed to forget dancing. Sometimes a sentence like this written in Tristan's hand. Today I removed a chain that wasn't there, and 3 people felt lighter. And sometimes one like this in Yvain's. Tonight the stars were not jealous of our lamps. I read them aloud at the counter to customers who pretended to be choosing nails while they listened. The market unfurled its improbable tents in the meadow beyond the gap, blue and green, and the third colour no tongue in wall can dare to name. Bottles sang. Mirrors rehearsed their good behaviour. A fox argued prices with a rabbit, and neither won. Amid the music and the scents like unkept promises, I walked at an old man's pace, which is to say I stopped when my memory asked me to stand still. The scarlet awning was not there. Awnings have their destinies as people do, but a stall of glass flowers caught the light and returned it in anonymous kindness. I bought a snowdrop and did not pay with anything I could not afford. Then, without trumpets, we saw them. No parade. No shouted names. A man and a woman, walking as if lanes had been invented for feet to trust them. He had my height improved. She had the sky's patience domesticated into grace. Tristan greeted the watchers first, as a king should greet any doorkeeper who has kept the world from fraying. Yvain smiled at the hedge, and the hedge forgot to be defensive. Victoria Forrester, now Mrs. Monday, waved from a distance, with the cheer of someone who found her story in its proper tense. The market, being wiser than most courts, made room. We went home for tea. That is the ceremony wall can afford, and the only one it requires. Una did not come. Roofs do not travel on market day. But she sent a cake that remembered birthdays. Tristan carried 2 baskets, because a king is just a porter with a wider door. Yvain set the cups precisely, as stars do with their distances. We spoke of roofs, bridges, and the rumour of a skyship whose captain had grown sentimental and took apprentices now for the pleasure of teaching knots. We spoke of the topaz, which behaved these days like an obedient punctuation mark, allowing sentences to end before they grew pompous. We spoke of Ditchwater Sal, who had taken to selling puddle charms that made children laugh and did no harm. A kingdom and a village were repairing each other by small work and frequent tea. At twilight we walked to the gap because farewells, even the easy ones, prefer thresholds. The market lamps began their soft arithmetic. Musicians argued gently with their strings and then forgave them. The watchers stood attentive and benign. Tristan embraced me with a care that understood bones. Yvain took my wife's hands and thanked her for soup and listening, which is the measure of queens. We said only the useful things people say when nothing useful is required. Mind your back. Keep your knife clean. If the kettle squeaks, oil the hinge, not the spout. They smiled as if these instructions were a crown polished from the inside. We stood there a long minute while the evening learned our names again. A breeze went by with the smell of apples and brass, a weather that remembers ships in clouds and bells in distant towers. My son and the star stepped toward the meadow that remains not a meadow. The market made space like a curtain politely parting. The hedges tilted their heads in blessing. They did not vanish. They grew smaller by that particular magic domestic love uses. The further they walked, the closer it felt. When we could not see their faces, we could still see their intentions. When we could not see their steps, we could still hear the road agreeing. And then, because stories know when to lower their voices, the market dimmed itself to kindness, and the night took the rest of the duty on. The last 500 words belong to quiet. I sweep the step in the mornings. The broom writes its old poem on stone. I set the bell, and it answers with the note that has kept our house in the right century. My hands still know rope, hinges, oil, and the angle at which a nail will obey. Sometimes a messenger comes, looking like a shepherd, smelling like hay and ink. He sits. We drink. He tells me that a bridge remembered how to hold, that a widow was given back her field by a clerk who discovered he preferred justice, that a child fell, cried, and was lifted with respect rather than hurry. I write these down in a ledger no taxman will ever see. In autumn the light in the lane turns thin and honourable. In winter the bread scolds the knife for rushing. In spring the hedges practice being new without insulting the old posts. In summer a moth will throw itself at our window as if the room were a confession it wished to make. The cat sleeps where the sun has the best manners. My wife hums all the hymns the vicar has forgotten. We are not grand, we are exact. That is the kind of immortality villages know. Sometimes I walk to the wall and lay my palm to the stone. It is warm, as if it has learned to keep two worlds in its back. The watchers, who have become philosophers without changing their hats, nod and say nothing. Across the gap the meadow waits, green and not green. Every 9th year it fills with the fare that taught my life to swallow astonishment and call it bread. I go there, and I remember a chain that broke by becoming irrelevant, a glass snowdrop that did not melt, a candle that burned a path from a boy's wish to a man's work, a white creature whose horn objected to lies, a ship that harvested thunder and planted skill, and a topaz that decided at last to be a law instead of a trophy. On fine evenings, if I stand in our doorway and look east with more patience than eyesight, I see a balcony in my mind's eye. Upon it, a woman walks with a light that does not bully the dark. A man stands beside her with maps that are being persuaded to tell the truth. Sometimes he laughs the laugh of someone who has just remembered a knot. Sometimes she leans her shoulder into his, and the constellations agree to rearrange nothing, which is their way of applause. I do not wave, they do not wave. Between us, the air does the waving on our behalf, but we still wonder whether the doors we keep and the vows we mend are the whole of what makes a world, or whether it is the smaller mercies, the cup refilled before it is empty, the broom hung by its head, the chain set down that finish the sentence, the stars begin. If you have listened this long, you know the craft. We boil the kettle, we set the bell, we keep the hinge oiled. When the market comes, we buy what we can afford, and when it goes, we remember what was given free. The courage to tell truth without jewelry, the wit to leave rooms better than we found them, the decency to let laws become their purpose. A father's work ends in the visible world and continues invisibly, where a hand once rested on a shoulder and taught the body how to carry light. It is late. The lane has arranged its few stars with care. The cat has ceased believing in theology for the night. My wife folds the cloth as if she knew where stories like to sleep. I will set this account aside. The bell is ready. The door is sure. The wall, older than either of us and younger than hope, stands where it should, keeping the peace between cabbage and miracle. If you pass by on some evening, tap the stone and listen. You will hear two worlds answer, and between them a human house ours. Yours saying, "Come in," the kettle's on, so too. 1100.